I had been planning this hiking trip for weeks. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a solo hike in a remote section of the woods I had always wanted to explore. I'm not a seasoned mountaineer, but I've hiked plenty of trails and felt confident in my ability to handle it. Still, there was something a little different about this one. It wasn't the difficulty or the distance. It was the fact that I was going into an area that wasn't often traveled by people. I had packed light but thoroughly. I knew I'd be out for a few days, so I brought enough water, food, and emergency supplies to last me the entire trip. My backpack felt comfortably snug on my back, my boots were well broken in, and my trekking poles clicked rhythmically on the trail as I set off. The morning was crisp, and the air smelled like pine and fresh earth. The sun was climbing in the sky, but the shadows still stretched long across the ground. Birds chirped above, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was the kind of day that made you feel alive, and I couldn't help but smile as I made my way down the well-worn path. The hike started out easy, a gentle ascent that wound through a thicket of evergreens and hardwoods. It was peaceful, and I was grateful for the solitude. There's something calming about being alone in nature. No distractions, no obligations, just you and the wilderness. The first few hours passed without incident. I came across a few small streams, hopped over a couple of rocks, and noticed signs of wildlife here and there. Prints in the mud, a rustle in the bushes, a flash of fur darting across the trail. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was, in every way, the kind of hike I had hoped for. A bit of challenge, a bit of peace, and a lot of natural beauty. Around midday, I decided to stop for a break. I found a large boulder near a creek, sat down, and took off my pack. I ate some nuts and dried fruit, drank water from my bottle, and looked out over the land. The creek flowed gently, its water crystal clear as it tumbled over rocks. A deer wandered by on the far side, unaware of my presence. It was one of those rare moments when you feel truly connected to the world around you. After a while, I packed up and continued along the trail. I knew the next section would be a bit steeper, but it didn't concern me. The idea of getting to the top and seeing the view was exciting. I could already imagine the vastness of the landscape, how the world would stretch out before me. I kept a steady pace, my legs moving easily with the rhythm of the hike. I had been on the trail for about 4 hours when I reached the base of the next incline. The path was rocky, uneven, and steep, but I was ready for it. As I climbed, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it had become. The birds seemed to have stopped singing, and the wind had died down. It was as though the forest had gone still, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I dismissed it. There was no reason to be paranoid. I was just alone in the woods, nothing more. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I kept going, reaching the crest of the hill and stopping to catch my breath. I looked out over the valley below. The view was stunning, mountains in the distance, valleys carved by centuries of water, trees stretching in every direction. It was the kind of sight that makes you feel small, like a speck in a much larger world. I took a moment to appreciate it. But as I stood there, I noticed something unusual in the distance. A dark shape moving in and out of view among the trees. I couldn't make it out at first, but it was too large and too far off to be a deer. It seemed to be pacing back and forth, just out of sight. I felt my heart rate increase, but I told myself it was probably another hiker or maybe even a bear. Bears are common in the area, and while they're generally not aggressive, they can be dangerous if startled. I decided to keep my distance, moving further up the trail. But as I did, the shape seemed to follow me, always just out of sight, always in the corner of my vision. I pressed on, but the unease continued to grow. The trail twisted and turned, and I began to lose track of where I was. The woods around me felt thicker now, the trees taller and closer together. It was quieter than before, and the air had an odd heaviness to it. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking behind me. At one point, I stopped to adjust my pack, and when I turned around, the shape was closer, much closer. It was no longer just a dark figure in the distance. It was something I could almost make out. It looked like a person, but something was off. They were hunched over, moving erratically. It was hard to tell if it was a person or something else entirely. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone else on the trail, maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Without thinking, I turned and started walking faster. The last thing I wanted was to get caught in some awkward situation, so I decided to take a different route, trying to lose whatever or whoever was following me. As I hurried down the path, my mind raced. What if it wasn't a hiker? What if it was something else? The thought of running into an animal, especially a predator, crossed my mind. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. They all lived in these woods, and they weren't always predictable. I tried to push the thought out of my mind and focus on finding a safe spot to stop and assess the situation. But it wasn't just animals I was worried about. Something about the way the figure moved, the strange way it stayed hidden, made me feel like I wasn't just dealing with nature anymore. It felt like I was being hunted. As I walked, my anxiety began to build. I needed to get to a clearing or somewhere open, but the trail kept narrowing, winding deeper into the woods. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a bear? A person with bad intentions? Someone lost? I wasn't sure, but I knew I needed to keep moving. The trail took a sharp turn, and I almost collided with a tree. The forest was dense now, the path barely visible in some spots. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every step more frantic than the last. The sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor seemed too loud, too obvious. And then I heard it, a snap of a twig. Behind me, I didn't stop to look, I just kept moving. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burn in my legs, focusing only on putting as much distance between myself and whatever was following me. The forest seemed to close in around me, and my breath came faster, ragged. I stumbled over a rock, nearly falling, but I caught myself and kept going. I couldn't let my guard down for a second. The trees thinned a bit, and I spotted a large boulder just ahead. I made my way toward it, hoping to find some cover or maybe even a better vantage point. When I reached the boulder, I crouched behind it, trying to quiet my breathing. I waited, straining to listen. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were coming for me. I pressed myself against the rock, trying to keep still. My muscles ached from the tension. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was no movement. Slowly, I peeked around the boulder. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, just out of reach. It was unmistakably a person, though they were still hunched, almost unnaturally so. Their clothes were ragged, their skin pale. They didn't move, just stared at me from the distance. I couldn't make myself move. I knew I had to, but my body was frozen. Time seemed to stretch on. The figure finally turned and vanished into the trees. I stayed where I was for a long time before I could convince myself to move again. I didn't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Eventually, I found my way back to the main trail, my heart still racing. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to explain what happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to be a lot more careful about where I chose to hike in the future. I remember the day I decided to go hiking alone in the mountains as if it was just yesterday, even though it was nearly a year ago. I had been planning it for a while. The weather was perfect for an adventure. Not too hot, not too cold, just crisp and fresh, with a slight breeze rustling through the trees. I had everything packed. A few bottles of water, some granola bars, a map, and a compass just in case. I had been on smaller hikes before, but nothing that would really challenge me, and this trail, the one I had chosen, was supposed to be a bit more strenuous. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. It was early, still a little misty in the air, and not many people had started their hikes yet. I parked my car in a small, nearly empty lot, grabbed my backpack, and set off on the trail. The path began to wind gently through the woods, the ground soft beneath my boots from the early morning dew. Birds were singing high up in the trees, and the only other sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the crunch of my feet on the dirt path. I started off slow, just taking it all in. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves turning golden with the first signs of fall. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with just a hint of pine. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel completely detached from the everyday noise of life. No phone, no traffic, just the sounds of nature around me. I had heard about this trail from a few friends who'd done it before, and they had said that the views from the top were worth every step of the climb. At first, everything went smoothly. The trail was well maintained and not too difficult. It sloped upwards gradually, and I kept moving at a steady pace, pausing every now and then to take a breath and admire the scenery. The higher I went, the more the forest opened up into small clearings with views of the surrounding mountains. I could see the peaks far off in the distance, their tips dusted with snow even though it was still early autumn. It wasn't until about 2 hours into the hike that things started to feel off. I had reached a section of the trail that seemed a little more rugged, with rocks poking up through the soil and roots that tangled across the path. The air was thinner up here, and I found myself pausing more frequently to catch my breath. I wasn't out of shape, but the climb was starting to get steeper. I didn't mind. I liked the challenge, but something felt strange. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the atmosphere was beginning to feel unsettling. I had been hiking alone for a while now, and I hadn't seen anyone since I crossed paths with a couple of hikers about 45 minutes back. It wasn't uncommon for people to hike solo, but the silence in this part of the woods felt heavier, like there was something I wasn't quite aware of. The trail narrowed here, and the trees grew tighter together, casting long shadows across the path. At one point, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle. As I lifted it to my lips, I heard something, a low, distant sound. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the birds. It was almost like a low, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere off the trail, deeper in the woods. I froze, listening carefully. The sound was faint, but it was there. It seemed to come in bursts, almost like footsteps, but there was a heaviness to it that didn't feel right. I stood still for a long moment trying to figure out what it was, but the sound didn't repeat. It faded away, leaving me in an uncomfortable silence. I brushed it off as my imagination, or maybe an animal in the distance, and kept moving forward. The trail got steeper as I pushed on, the ground now covered in loose gravel that shifted underfoot. I had to be careful where I stepped or risk slipping. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I kept going. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I felt. It wasn't a bad feeling, exactly, but more of a nagging sense that I was getting farther and farther from civilization. I had passed the last marker about 30 minutes ago, and according to the map, I was about halfway up the mountain. I decided to take a longer break and find a spot to rest. I found a large rock near the side of the trail that jutted out over the edge of a cliff. The view was breathtaking, the valley stretching far below with the river winding its way through the forest. I sat down, pulling out a granola bar and taking a deep breath. It felt good to stop for a while, to let my body rest and soak in the beauty of the mountains. The wind picked up for a moment, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. That's when I heard it again. The sound. The low thumping, rhythmic and distant, but louder now. It was closer, almost beneath me. I stood up immediately, scanning the area around me. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no animals, just the trees and rocks. My heart started to race, and I felt a sudden unease wash over me. Maybe it was an animal, a bear, or something else. Whatever it wasn't a sound I was used to hearing in the woods. I debated for a moment whether I should turn back, but I quickly dismissed the thought. It was probably just an animal or some other natural sound I didn't recognize. I had to keep going. The summit was still my goal, and I wasn't about to turn back so soon. I continued up the trail, but now I kept my senses on high alert. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate. The thumping sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a quiet, unsettling feeling, like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, half expecting to see something, anything, moving behind me, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the rocks, and the trail winding its way upwards. As I reached a particularly steep section, the trail narrowed again, the rocks growing loose and unstable beneath my feet. I had to use my hands to climb over some of the larger boulders, carefully choosing my footholds. The wind had picked up again, and the trees swayed above me, creaking and groaning in the breeze. I reached another clearing, where the view was even more spectacular. I stopped, feeling the tension leave my shoulders just for a moment, and took a deep breath, savoring the beauty of the landscape. But then, I heard it again, this time unmistakably close. The thumping sound, like footsteps, but more deliberate, more weighty, came from just beyond the trees, not far from the trail. My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to turn around, but I didn't want to seem like I was running from something. Instead, I stood still, trying to listen. The sound was louder now, closer, and I could even hear a scraping noise, like something large was pushing through the underbrush. I took a step backward, instinctively trying to distance myself from the sound. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it was. Was it a person? No, I hadn't seen anyone for hours. Was it an animal? But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate for an animal. Maybe it was a bear or something else that could move through the trees like that. I didn't know, but the idea of finding out wasn't appealing. I decided to keep moving, picking up my pace as I hurried up the trail. The thumping seemed to follow me, staying just behind, just close enough that I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't quite right, like something wasn't supposed to be there. The fear started to creep in then, a cold, clammy sensation that tightened in my chest. I had to keep going, had to reach the top, but the noise, whatever it was getting closer. I reached the top after what felt like an eternity. The summit was a small, rocky outcrop with a panoramic view of the valley below. I stood there for a long time, catching my breath, trying to push the unease away. The wind howled around me, and I could see for miles in every direction. But there was no sign of anyone, no sound but the wind. The thumping had stopped, leaving me in an eerie silence. I realized then that I had been imagining things. My mind had started to play tricks on me. The trail had been harder than I expected, and the isolation had gotten to me. I spent a while on the summit, eating another granola bar, taking pictures and just enjoying the peace. When I felt ready to head back down, I retraced my steps. The hike back was uneventful. No strange sounds, no thumping, no sense of being watched. I made it back to the car just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the sky. I was exhausted, but I felt a deep sense of relief. Whatever had unsettled me on the way up was behind me now. It was just the mountain, the wilderness, and me. I never figured out what caused that feeling. Maybe it was an animal I didn't see. Maybe it was just my mind. But whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't planning on hiking that trail alone again anytime soon. It started with a plan I had been building up to for months. I'd always been into solo hiking. There was something about the silence of the woods, the sound of wind moving through pine needles, the crunch of gravel under my boots, and the cool feeling of being completely away from everything. No phones ringing, no emails, no people. Just me, the trail, and the mountains. I had picked out a long trail system deep in northern Idaho. It was in the Panhandle National Forests, near the Canadian border. The place was remote, hard to get to, and not very well known. That was perfect for me. The main trail loop I had mapped out was just under 40 miles, and I planned to take it slow over 4 days. There were no ranger stations nearby, no cell service, and barely any trail markers, just old wooden signs and rock stacks from past hikers. It was exactly what I was looking for, real wilderness. I parked my truck at a gravel lot near the edge of the forest. There were no other vehicles there. It was a weekday in early October. The air was cool and dry, and the leaves had just started changing color. I packed my gear, sleeping bag, tent, food for 5 days, extra water, a small gas stove, bear spray, a knife, a first aid kit, and a map I had printed from an old Forest Service website. I double-checked everything, shouldered my pack, and started walking just after sunrise. The trail started off wide and gentle, weaving through tall evergreens. For the first few miles, it felt like every other hike I'd been on. Peaceful, calm, nothing unusual. I kept a steady pace, stopping now and then to take in the quiet. The deeper I got, the thinner the trail became. The forest closed in around me. Trees grew tighter together, and the trail narrowed to a strip just wide enough for one boot in front of the other. Ferns grew thick along the sides, brushing my legs as I walked. It was wild country, untouched. By the end of the first day, I had gone about 10 miles. I pitched my tent on a flat patch beside a small stream and ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky. I sat on a rock for a long time that night, listening to the sounds around me. Nothing but the stream and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. No animals, no insects, no distant traffic. Just quiet. I slept hard that night and woke early to a heavy fog. Everything was wet. I boiled some water for coffee and packed up. Day 2 took me deeper into the woods. I lost sight of the sun before noon because the tree canopy was so thick. The trail became more overgrown. A few times I had to stop and push branches out of the way or backtrack to find where the trail picked up again. It was slower going, and I kept checking my map, making sure I was still on the right path. Around mid-afternoon, I passed an old wooden marker nailed to a tree. The paint had faded, but I could make out the word Black Hollow and an arrow pointing left off the main trail. I remembered seeing that name on the map. Black Hollow was supposed to be a small valley with a stream, a decent place to camp, but I wasn't planning to stop there. Still, I felt like I should mark it mentally in case I needed to come back that way. I kept walking for another couple hours, then found a clearing to set up camp for the night. That evening, as I cooked some rice on the little stove, I had the odd feeling of being watched. I looked around a few times, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing, just empty woods. The feeling didn't go away, though. It sat with me through dinner, through cleaning up, and even when I crawled into the tent. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a snapping sound. It was sharp, loud, and close. My heart was pounding. I stayed still, listening. There was nothing after that, just silence. I told myself it was probably a branch breaking under the weight of a raccoon or deer. I kept telling myself that until I finally drifted back to sleep. The third day was the turning point. I packed up and continued deeper onto the trail. According to the map, I had a big loop to complete that day, cutting through a denser part of the forest and eventually swinging back toward the east side of the range. I expected it to be rougher terrain, and it was. The trail almost vanished in places, just faint impressions in the moss and dirt. I relied more and more on my compass and the map. Around midday, I lost the trail completely. I had followed what I thought was the path, but it led me into a tangle of fallen trees and thick underbrush. I stopped, took off my pack, and tried to retrace my steps. After 20 minutes, I found a spot I recognized. A crooked tree with a lightning scar running down its trunk. I was relieved. I adjusted my direction and started heading back toward where the trail should have been. Then I saw the footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresher, not yet dried, and pressed deep into the soft soil near a mossy rock. It was a hiking boot similar to mine in shape and size, but it pointed in a different direction. The print led off-trail, slightly uphill. My first thought was that someone else had been through here recently. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I didn't like that idea. It wasn't the presence of another person that bothered me. It was how remote this area was. What were the chances someone else had chosen this exact path at the same time? Still, I followed the prints for a bit. They were spaced far apart like someone was moving fast, and they eventually led into a narrow game trail. I followed it for another 10 minutes before I realized I was getting farther off course. I stopped, turned around, and decided to head back toward the main trail. That's when I noticed my compass needle was spinning slowly in circles. It didn't stop. I tapped it, shook it gently, and held it away from anything metal. Kept spinning. I checked my backup compass from my bag. Same thing. My stomach dropped. I looked up at the trees, trying to get a sense of direction from the sun, but it was overcast. The sky was just a dull gray above the treetops. I took a deep breath and walked back the way I came. I followed my boot prints in the soft ground, stepping carefully, retracing each step. But the terrain didn't look familiar anymore. Everything looked the same: thick trees, moss-covered ground, sloping hills. I kept moving, but something was wrong. I should have hit the lightning-scarred tree again by now. I didn't. Panic crept in slowly. I forced myself to stop and set up camp right where I was. It was too late in the day to risk wandering aimlessly. I needed rest. Maybe I'd find the trail again in the morning. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I laid there in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening. There were no animal sounds, no bugs, nothing. Just dead quiet. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside the tent. It was slow, methodical, like footsteps. Not running, not animal-like, but slow, deliberate walking. The sound circled my tent twice, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I gripped the knife I kept next to me in the sleeping bag and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. I must have blacked out eventually because I woke up to daylight and a tent soaked in dew. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and looked for prints. Nothing. The moss was undisturbed. No broken twigs. No signs of anything passing through. I packed up quickly and started walking east. I had no compass now, no map that could help. I just picked a direction and went with it, hoping to eventually cross a trail or stream or road. Hours passed, then an entire day. I drank from a small stream, purified the water, and ate the last of my jerky. I had one more day of food left. The forest was endless. The same thick trees, the same silent hills. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, but I kept moving. Then I found the cabin. It was old, gray, and sagging in the middle like it had been forgotten for decades. It was half hidden by trees, with a moss-covered roof and a broken chimney. I stood frozen for a long time before walking toward it. The door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, it was dark and damp. Dust covered everything. An old table, a chair with one leg missing, an iron stove rusted through. There were no tools, no food, nothing useful. But someone had been there. The floor had footprints in the dust. New ones. My chest tightened. I backed out of the cabin and looked around. No one. Still, that feeling came back, the same one I had 2 nights ago. I was being watched. I moved away from the cabin quickly, heading downhill. I knew downhill usually led to water, and water meant possible trails or signs of life. I walked until dark, then forced myself to stop and set up a makeshift camp. I didn't bother with the tent. I just rolled out the bag, wrapped myself in it, and kept the knife in my hand the whole night. In the early morning, I finally found something, a dirt road. It was narrow and muddy with deep ruts, clearly not used often, but it was man-made. I followed it, walking for hours, blistered and hungry, until I finally saw a gate made of rusted wire. Beyond it was a gravel lot. My truck was there. I stood there in shock for a minute, trying to understand how I had circled all the way back. I had been walking in the opposite direction, or so I thought. I unlocked the truck, climbed. I had always loved the outdoors. There's something about being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the faint scent of pine, that makes everything feel right. It had been a stressful few months, work, family issues, a never-ending list of things to do. I needed to clear my head, and I figured a solo hike would do the trick. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, the kind of crisp air that makes you feel alive. I packed up my gear the night before, double-checking everything. A small tent, my sleeping bag, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my knife. I didn't want to carry too much. It was supposed to be a 2-day trip. A short hike to clear my head, nothing crazy. I woke up early, before the sun had even risen, and hit the trail just as it was starting to get light. The path wasn't too hard. It was a well-trodden route, one that many hikers had walked before. Still, I was in the middle of nowhere, and the solitude felt almost unnatural. First, it was peaceful. The rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the soft crunch of dirt beneath my boots. I felt like I was in my element. The first few miles passed quickly. The trail wound through a dense forest, with towering trees and thick underbrush on either side. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of clean, crisp scent that only the wild can provide. I made sure to stop every so often, taking a drink, munching on some trail mix, and checking my map. I wasn't entirely sure where I was going, but I had a vague sense of direction. I trusted my instincts, and the map was easy enough to follow. At around noon, I stopped at a small creek to refill my water bottle. The sound of running water was calming, and I sat on a rock for a while, just listening. Everything felt so still, so quiet. It was as if the world had been reduced to just this one small patch of land. But something didn't feel quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the air had grown colder, or the way the sunlight seemed to be fading a little too quickly. But I ignored it, shrugged it off. There was no reason to be paranoid. I was in control. As I continued on the trail, the terrain started to get more rugged. The path became steeper, and the forest grew thicker. The trees here were older, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The shadows seemed deeper, like something was lurking just out of sight. But I wasn't scared. I had hiked in places like this before. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing where I planned to set up camp. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and I knew I needed to act quickly if I wanted to get my tent up before it got too dark. I found a good spot, a flat patch of dirt near a stream that bubbled gently in the background. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a subtle thing, just a twinge of unease in the pit of my stomach. But it was enough to make me glance around the clearing a few times, just to be sure I wasn't being watched. The trees around me were tall and dense, their branches swaying in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I shrugged it off again. It was probably just my nerves acting up. The fire crackled and popped, and I focused on the comforting warmth it provided. The sky turned dark, and the stars began to emerge, one by one, like distant beacons of light in an endless sky. But that was when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling in the bushes. I paused, straining my ears to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, followed by the soft snap of a twig breaking. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, my heart thudding in my chest. I shone the light around the clearing, sweeping it across the trees, but there was nothing there. No eyes reflecting in the beam, no movement. The night was still, unnervingly still. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. It was just an animal, nothing to worry about. But even as I sat back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I felt like someone or something was lurking just beyond the trees, hidden in the darkness, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to distract myself, poking at the fire and trying to keep my thoughts occupied. But the feeling persisted. The hours stretched on, and the noise in the woods seemed to grow, rustling, cracking, faint footfalls just out of reach. It was like the whole forest had come alive, and it wasn't the peaceful, natural life I was used to. This felt different. This felt intentional. I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. The silence outside was deafening, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief. But that didn't last long. It wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the noise that had come before. It was the way it had been getting closer, just outside my reach. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees. The fire outside had died down to nothing but a faint glow, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the tent. Then it came again, a loud snap of a twig, followed by more crunching and rustling. But this time it was different. It was too close, too deliberate. Someone or something was moving just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. I gripped my knife, the one I kept beside me for situations like this. But even as I held it, I knew it wasn't enough. The sounds outside stopped, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. The next few hours were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. I was too scared. I kept hearing movement, the sound of footsteps in the leaves, circling my camp, getting closer and closer. But every time I peered out of the tent, there was nothing there. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking with fear. I knew I needed to get out of there. I didn't care if I wasn't fully packed. I grabbed my things and left the clearing without a second thought, not looking back once. The hike down felt longer than it had on the way up. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. The woods were eerily quiet now, too quiet. I made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon, my legs sore and my mind racing. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I reached my car. I didn't feel any sense of relief, though. If anything, I felt like something was still with me. As I drove home, I kept thinking about what had happened. What had I heard in the woods? Who or what had been out there? It was clear I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy, but I couldn't explain it either. When I got back to my apartment, I unpacked my gear and sat down to eat something. I had a strange sense of peace, but it wasn't the same as the calm I had felt when I set out on my hike. The wild had shown me something that day, something I couldn't name, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. I've been back to the woods since then. I've gone on hikes in other places, tried to clear my head again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps just outside my tent, and the way the woods seemed to close in around me, as if they were hiding something. I know one thing for sure. The next time I head out on a solo hike, I'll be a lot more cautious, because you never really know what's out there. I started the hike around 6 in the morning. The air was still cold, and the sunlight hadn't fully reached the forest floor yet. I remember the sound of my boots crunching down on the gravel path, the quiet rustle of wind moving through the trees, and how still everything felt. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo 3-day hike through a long loop trail in a national forest I hadn't explored before. It wasn't popular with tourists, and that was what I wanted. I was looking for quiet, solitude, and a break from the noise of everything back home. The trail I picked was one of the longer loops, just over 30 miles in total, and it was marked well enough, with trail signs every few miles and small colored blazes painted on trees. I had my pack fully loaded with food, a small tent, sleeping bag, water, and a filtration system in case I needed to refill from streams. I also carried a compass and paper map, though I had GPS on my phone as backup. I double-checked everything before I left my car at the trailhead, made sure I logged my hike at the registration box, and then headed into the woods. The first 5 miles went by without a problem. The trail weaved through dense patches of pine and open spaces full of ferns and low brush. I passed a creek early on and refilled one of my water bottles, filtering the water through my setup. I felt good. My pack sat comfortably on my back, and my boots were broken in enough that I didn't worry about blisters. But around mid-morning, I made a decision that would change the entire trip. I saw a side trail that wasn't marked on the main map, just a narrow path cutting off to the right, partly overgrown but still visible enough to follow. There was no trail sign pointing toward it, and the ground showed fewer footprints than the main trail. But something about it pulled me in. I can't even explain why. Maybe I was just curious. Maybe I wanted to explore something new, to feel like I had discovered something that wasn't already on a map. I stood there for a while, looking down that path, listening to how quiet it was. It didn't seem threatening, just empty. I told myself I'd only follow it for a mile or two and turn around. I didn't think it would matter, so I stepped off the main trail and started down that narrow path. At first, it wasn't much different from the main loop, just narrower and more rugged. Roots stuck out across the trail like stretched cords, and some parts of the ground were soft with damp moss. There were no trail markers now, and I had to pay more attention to where I was walking. But it still felt like a trail, like someone had walked this way before, maybe a long time ago. I guessed it might have been an old fire road or a hunter's trail. As I kept going, the trees seemed to grow closer together. The canopy thickened, and less light reached the ground. I had to duck under low-hanging branches and move around fallen logs that hadn't been cleared. I kept checking my compass to make sure I was generally heading northeast, which was the same direction as the main loop. I figured as long as I didn't go too far off course, I could reconnect with the main trail later. But I wasn't paying enough attention to distance. I kept going, past where I said I'd turn back. 1 mile turned into 2, then 3. Time started to get away from me. The trail became harder to follow. At some point, it wasn't even a trail anymore, just a gap in the trees where the ground was slightly more packed down. But I didn't stop. I kept going. It was early afternoon when I realized I hadn't seen anything man-made in hours. No blazes, no signs, not even a cleared campsite or fire ring. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where I was, but the trail I had taken wasn't on it. I checked my GPS, but my phone wasn't picking up a signal anymore. That wasn't a surprise. Some of these forests had dead zones. I tried not to panic. I still had my compass. I could head west and eventually intersect the main loop again. That was the plan. I turned west and started walking. But now the forest was different. The trees looked the same in every direction. No more trail under my feet, just thick leaves, fallen branches, and uneven ground. I walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more, but never found the main trail. The sun was sinking lower. The light filtered through the trees at an angle now, and the shadows grew longer. I stopped and took off my pack. My shoulders ached from the weight, and my legs were starting to feel the strain. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out my map again, trying to trace a line from where I left the main trail to where I thought I might be. But it was just guessing now. I didn't know. The trees were too thick to see any landmarks. Everything looked the same. I set up camp that night in a small clearing. I didn't want to walk in the dark. I cleared a space, pitched my tent, and made a small fire from the driest wood I could find. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside the tent kept me awake. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just animals, probably deer, maybe raccoons, nothing big. The next morning, I packed up early and started walking again. I still had enough food and water, and my legs felt better after a little rest. I followed my compass west, but the forest just kept going. No trail, no sounds of other hikers, just the endless sound of wind in the leaves and birds calling somewhere far off. By the third day, I was starting to feel it. My food was running low. I had maybe 2 meals left. My water was low too. I came across a small muddy stream, filtered what I could, and hoped it wouldn't make me sick. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the main trail. I hadn't even seen footprints. That started to bother me. How far off had I gone? How deep into the forest was I? I kept checking my compass. West, always west, but still no trail. I started to ration my food, just a protein bar in the morning and a handful of trail mix in the evening. I moved slower now. My legs ached constantly. My back hurt from the pack, and my feet were starting to blister. I still didn't panic. I told myself people got lost all the time and found their way out. I was still walking. I still had gear. I still had a chance. But then I ran into cliffs. It happened on the 4th day. I was pushing through a thick stretch of forest when the ground just stopped. A long ridge dropped off sharply in front of me, 30 or 40 feet down into a valley. I hadn't expected that. I checked my map again, but there were no cliffs marked in the area where I thought I was. That scared me. Either the map was outdated, or I was somewhere completely different. I couldn't climb down the cliff safely. It was too steep, and the rock was loose in places. I had to find another way around. I followed the ridge south for hours, hoping to find a slope I could descend. By then, my legs were shaking. My water was almost gone again. I hadn't eaten since the night before. Every part of me felt weak and sore. Eventually, I found a section of the ridge that wasn't as steep. I climbed down slowly, gripping onto exposed roots and sliding on my back where I had to. I scraped my palms on sharp rock, tore a hole in my pants, but I made it down. The valley below was dark and damp, thick with undergrowth. I hoped it might lead to a stream or a logging road. Instead, I found animal bones. They were scattered across the ground near a patch of flattened grass. Mostly deer bones, some fresh, some bleached white. A few of them had been chewed. I didn't like the look of it. I moved on quickly, but the feeling stuck with me. Something about the way the bones were spread out. The way the ground looked like something had laid there. I didn't stop to rest that night. I kept walking until I couldn't anymore. I found a shallow cave near the edge of the valley and slept in it, curled up with my pack against my chest. The cold got into my bones. I couldn't make a fire. There was nothing dry enough to burn. My lighter wouldn't catch on damp twigs. I just lay there, shivering and staring out at the dark woods. The next morning, I heard something move through the trees. Heavy footsteps, not close but not far either. I stayed completely still and waited for the sound to pass. Whatever it was, it didn't call out. It didn't make any noise except for movement. Eventually, it went quiet again. I didn't know what it was. Could have been a bear, maybe a moose, but it didn't sound like 4 legs. It sounded like 2. I moved quickly after that. I didn't run, I couldn't. My legs were too weak, but I walked with everything I had left. I didn't take breaks. I didn't stop to eat. I just walked. I kept the compass in my hand the entire time and pushed west. It was early evening when I saw the power lines. They cut through the trees in a wide, cleared path. Thick steel towers stretched off into the distance. I've never been so relieved to see something man-made in my life. I almost cried. I dropped to my knees and just stared at them for a minute. Then I got up and followed them. The towers led to a gravel service road, and the road led to a highway. I flagged down a passing car just before sunset. A couple driving a pickup stopped, and I climbed into the back without saying anything. I couldn't speak. I was shaking too hard. They drove me to the nearest ranger station, and I told the rangers everything. They said I was almost 50 miles off the main loop. I've been planning the trip for months. After a rough winter, my head was a mess. Too many late nights stuck inside, too many arguments with people I didn't care for, too much scrolling through the same garbage on my phone. I needed out, not just a walk around the block or a weekend with friends. I needed to feel away from everything. I picked a trail deep in the Canadian Rockies, off the usual routes. It was one I'd read about online in an old hiking forum. They'd said it was remote, hard to reach, and even harder to finish. Not dangerous, just tough. Perfect. It wasn't a big name trail with signs everywhere or a gift shop waiting at the end. That's exactly what I wanted. It ran about 25 miles point to point, winding through valleys, crossing rivers, with an old fire lookout near the top of one ridge where people sometimes set up camp. I drove out alone and parked at a gravel turnout near the trailhead. I hadn't seen a single other car for the last hour of the drive. No service on my phone either. I had a paper map, a compass, a full pack with food, a first aid kit, and enough water and gear for 3 days. I had a satellite tracker too, just in case, something I never used but always brought. The first day was great. Hard hiking, but peaceful. Tall trees, distant mountains, the rush of snowmelt in the streams. No sounds but birds and wind. The ground was a mix of packed dirt and stone, patches of mud in the low spots. Felt good to be out. I stopped around 6 p.m. and set up camp in a clearing beside a creek. I made a simple dinner and sat against a tree as the light faded. Just quiet and cold air and that smell of pine and moss. No sounds but water and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. Probably deer or small animals. Normal stuff. That night was still. I didn't sleep great, but I never do on the first night in the backcountry. Every crunch of leaves or gust of wind makes you half wake up. But nothing unusual happened. I woke around 6 a.m., packed up, and kept going. The next section was tougher. It climbed steadily, weaving through thick forest that let in almost no sun. There were dead trees everywhere, fallen across the path, making me climb over or detour around them. Some of the trees had claw marks on them. Not fresh, just long, pale scrapes in the bark. I figured black bears. Normal for the area. It got colder as I gained elevation. Around noon, I found an old cabin off the trail. Not on my map. Just a small, slanted structure, half hidden by trees, maybe 50 feet from the path. It was made of weathered logs, moss growing along the roof. The door was open, hanging by one hinge. I walked up slowly, not because I was scared, just curious. Inside, it was dark and smelled like wet wood. There was a rotted cot in one corner and an old stove with a rusted pipe running through the roof. The floor sagged in places. I saw a few bones in the corner. Small ones, maybe a rabbit or some rodent. It didn't feel spooky, just forgotten. I moved on. The trail narrowed and got steeper, curling up toward the ridge where the fire lookout was supposed to be. It was late afternoon when I reached it. The building was still there, perched on a narrow flat spot just below the summit. It had a metal roof, weather-beaten boards, and thick glass windows. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was dusty but dry. There was an old cot with a foam mattress, a metal chair, and a small table. Someone had left a few empty water bottles and a torn sleeping bag. I set up my gear and made a quick meal. I sat outside for a while, looking out across the valley. Everything felt so far away. No roads, no noise, just wind pushing through the trees far below. That night, I slept lightly again. At some point, I heard something outside, a steady, crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel or packed dirt. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and listened. It stopped. I waited for several minutes, holding my breath. Nothing, just wind, probably an animal. I told myself that and lay back down, but I kept my headlamp close and didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I started the descent. The other side of the trail dropped fast, switchbacks down through thicker forest, sharp rocks, and narrow ledges. The air was cooler on this side. I moved slow. I stopped around midday to rest and eat a snack near a rocky outcrop that gave a clear view of the valley. I hadn't seen anyone for 2 days. I didn't expect to, but about half an hour after I got moving again, I noticed something strange. I saw boot prints, not mine. They were fresher than mine too. Deep in the mud, clear treads. Not old, not washed out. Someone had come this way not long before me, maybe that morning. I didn't hear anyone, but the trail was quiet. It was possible someone had passed through early while I was still up at the lookout. But then I saw more. At one point, the boot prints veered off the trail and into the woods. Not a marked route, just gone. I paused there, staring at them. Then I moved on. An hour later, I saw something else. Tarp. It was green and partially hidden behind a large fallen tree. Not pitched like a shelter, just thrown over something. I approached it slowly. I didn't know why I felt nervous, but I did. I felt my skin get tight and my chest go hollow. I got close enough to lift the edge with a stick. Underneath were animal bones. A lot of them, clean, picked dry. Some had dirt still on them. Some were broken. At first I thought maybe it was someone processing meat, like a hunter using the area as a temporary base. But then I saw a shoe, not an animal's. A human shoe buried under the bones, torn and dirty. I let the tarp drop and backed away. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but it didn't feel right. Maybe someone hunting illegally, maybe worse. I didn't want to find out. I moved fast after that. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trees. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt watched. The trail sloped downward, twisting around the mountainside. I didn't stop to eat again. I barely drank water. Just wanted to get to the end, back to the road where I'd arranged for a shuttle pickup. By late afternoon, I was almost there. Just 2 more miles. I kept thinking how weird everything felt, like I was being funneled down a chute. No options, no detours. Just this trail and thick trees pressing in on both sides. Then I saw the bag. It was a backpack, not mine, sitting in the middle of the trail. It was zipped up, no tags or name. Looked like it had been dropped there recently, no dust, no leaves stuck to it. I didn't touch it. I walked in a wide circle around it and kept going. My hands were shaking. My breath felt thin. Half an hour later, I saw a figure. Far behind me, I turned to glance back and caught a glimpse of someone on the trail. Too far to see clearly, but definitely human. Tall, wearing dark clothing. Standing still. I froze. Looked again. He was gone. I don't know if he stepped off the trail or ducked behind something, but he wasn't there anymore. I started running. I didn't care about twisting an ankle or burning out my legs. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back. My throat burned. I kept thinking about the tarp, the bones, the shoe, the bag, and the way that person had just stood there, watching. I didn't stop until I saw the road through the trees, gravel and pavement. My shuttle car was there, empty, waiting just like it was supposed to be. I tore the door open, climbed inside, and locked it. I sat there shaking, heart slamming in my chest, staring at the trail entrance, waiting for someone to step out of the woods. No one came. Eventually, I calmed down enough to drive. I drove until I found a small town with a gas station and a working phone. I sat there for over an hour, not sure what to do. I didn't call the police. I didn't want to explain what I saw when I didn't have real proof. What would I say? That I saw bones and a shoe and someone standing in the woods? That's not illegal. It's just strange. But I never went back, and I never will. For weeks after, I kept checking the news, waiting to see if a body had been found or if someone had gone missing out there. Nothing ever came up. The mountains kept their silence. And I learned that the most dangerous things out in the wilderness aren't bears or storms or injuries. It's people. People with time, with isolation, and with no one to answer to. Sometimes they wait off trail, and sometimes they follow. I went hiking alone in late September. I had taken a few solo hikes before, but nothing too far from places with people. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted quiet. I wanted to clear my head. Things hadn't been great lately. Stress at work, a relationship that ended badly, and just that general feeling like I wasn't getting anywhere in life. Hiking always helped, and being out in the woods gave me the kind of silence and space I couldn't get anywhere else. So I picked a new place I'd never tried before. A long trail that looped through a forested mountain range about 4 hours from where I lived. The trail wasn't too popular, but that's what drew me to it. I found it on an old hiking forum. A guy had posted about it a few years back, said it was beautiful and barely touched. The trail didn't even show up on Google Maps unless you really zoomed in, and even then it was just a dotted line. It had no official parking lot, no big signs, just a small gravel pull-off on the side of a quiet road. The route was supposed to be about 15 miles total, looping through a stretch of forest with some steep climbs and a few spots where the trees opened up to wide mountain views. I figured I'd take it slow, maybe spend one night out there and finish the loop the next day. I packed enough food and water for 2 full days and brought my sleeping bag, tarp, and enough warm clothes. Nights were getting cooler. I also packed a good flashlight, extra batteries, my compass, a map printed from that old forum post, and a small first aid kit. I left early in the morning and reached the trailhead just before noon. There was no one else around, just my car, the gravel, and the woods. The first few miles were quiet and peaceful. The trail was narrow and barely worn, with brush and leaves covering most of it. I had to check the map every 30 minutes just to be sure I was still on the right path. The trees were thick, mostly oaks and maples, their leaves already starting to turn. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and old wood. I liked that smell. It reminded me of camping as a kid. Birds chirped every now and then, but for the most part it was just me and the forest. Around mile 5, I stopped for lunch on a flat rock beside a small stream. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my car. No tire tracks, no boot prints, nothing. Just silence and trees. That was the first time I noticed something felt a little off. Not wrong, just off. Like the quiet wasn't normal. I didn't hear any squirrels rustling in the underbrush or bugs buzzing around. It wasn't dead quiet, but it was just quiet enough to make me notice. Still, I figured maybe it was just the season, or maybe the animals kept to themselves more up here. I kept going. The trail started to climb around mile 7. I was sweating pretty good by then, even with the cool air. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew I needed to find a spot to set up camp before dark. There weren't many flat clearings, so I pushed on a bit farther until I found a patch of ground beside a large fallen tree. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I laid out my tarp, unrolled my sleeping bag, and took off my boots to let my feet breathe. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and sat there staring up at the orange sky through the branches. Felt peaceful again for a while, like I'd found the silence I came for. That night, though, something woke me up. I'm a light sleeper when I'm outdoors. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves gets into my dreams. At first, I thought it was just that. I heard something moving through the woods. Not close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but it was moving slow, crunching dry leaves underfoot. I laid still, listening. No flashlight, no noise from me, just my ears trying to figure out what it was. It didn't sound like a deer. I've heard deer plenty of times while camping. They move faster. They pause. They don't walk in a straight, steady rhythm like that. This was different. It was one step at a time. One crunch, then another, same pace, no pauses. It circled to the left of my camp. I didn't move. I held my breath. Then it stopped. The silence was louder than the footsteps. I waited, counting seconds in my head. I reached slowly for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it into the woods where the sound came from. Nothing, just trees. I stayed awake for a while after that, sitting up in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand. I didn't hear anything else, and after about an hour, I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I looked around the area where I heard the noise. There were leaves scattered everywhere, but I couldn't find any clear prints. The ground wasn't soft enough to hold tracks. I told myself it was probably just an animal and I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Not something, someone. I packed up and kept moving. I was about halfway through the loop. I figured I'd be back at my car by early evening if I kept a steady pace. The trail got steeper after that, climbing higher into the hills. I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. Around mile 10, I noticed a tree with strange marks on it. Long scratches down the bark, about shoulder height. It looked fresh. The inner wood was still light, not darkened from weather or time. I stopped and stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what made it. Could have been a bear, but the spacing was odd. The lines were narrow, too close together. Not claws, something sharper, like a knife. I didn't like that. I kept going, walking faster now. The trail narrowed again near the top of the ridge. There was a clearing up there with a good view of the valley below. I stopped to rest and looked out over the trees. It was beautiful, still and wide, with colors just starting to turn. I drank some water, ate a protein bar, and sat there for a few minutes. But I couldn't relax. That same feeling crept in again, like I was being watched. I kept checking behind me. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake it. When I stood to leave, I saw something across the clearing. Another person, just for a second. He was maybe 50 yards away, standing still, not moving, mostly hidden between two trees. I only saw part of him, one shoulder, half a leg. He was wearing dark clothes, maybe a jacket. But the way he stood there, not walking, not making a sound, it made my chest tighten. I looked down for a second, maybe half a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. I froze. My mind ran wild. Could have been a hunter. Could have been another hiker. Could have been nothing. But the way he moved or didn't move stuck with me. I didn't call out. I didn't wave. I just turned and walked. Fast. I wanted to be done with the trail. I wanted to be back at my car, back on the road, away from the trees. The last 5 miles were downhill, but they felt longer than anything I'd walked in my life. Every sound behind me made me spin around. I kept checking the trees. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I kept seeing things, shapes between trees, flashes of movement, dark clothing through the leaves. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped. So did they. I waited. Nothing. I walked again. I heard them again. Always just far enough back that I couldn't see anyone. Always just out of sight. I considered running, but the trail was narrow and covered in roots. If I tripped, I could break my leg, and then I'd really be in trouble. So I walked faster, my heart pounding, eyes scanning every part of the woods around me. At one point, I dropped my map. I didn't go back for it. By the time I saw the road through the trees, the sun was almost gone. Just a pale orange glow through the branches. I pushed through the last stretch of trail and stepped out onto the gravel pull-off where I'd left my car. And my car was gone. I stood there staring at the empty spot for a full minute, my mind blank. Gone. I checked the gravel. No tire marks, no broken glass, no signs of towing, just an empty space where it should have been. That's when real panic set in. My phone had no signal. I walked up and down the road in both directions, holding my phone up, praying for bars. Nothing. No houses nearby. No other cars. I sat down on a rock and tried to think. If someone stole my car, how did they know it would be there? How would they have gotten to it without me hearing? There was no cell service, no way to call a tow. And even if I started walking, I didn't know how far the nearest town was. It had taken me 4 hours to drive here from home, and this wasn't a main road. I didn't even know which direction was faster. I decided to walk back down the road, the same way I came in. I had about an hour of light left. I figured maybe I'd find a house or someone driving by. I didn't. Not that night. I walked until it was too dark to see, then left the road and found a patch of grass beside a rock to lay down. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, shivering, listening. I heard a car at one point in the distance, but it never came close. I thought about flagging it down if it did, but the forest swallowed the sound too quickly. In the morning, I kept walking. My legs were sore, and I was down to half a bottle of water. I set out on the trail alone, just me and the dense forest around me. It was an early morning in late autumn, and the air was crisp with that slight chill that told you the day would warm up eventually, but for now, the cold was biting. The sun had barely risen, but I knew the hike would take most of the day, so I didn't mind the coolness. The ground was wet from an overnight rain, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of pine trees. It was the kind of quiet that can only be found deep in the woods, isolated, peaceful, but with an underlying feeling that something could happen at any moment. I had been hiking for a few hours when I realized I hadn't passed anyone else on the trail. It wasn't unusual. This trail wasn't particularly popular, and I preferred it that way. Solitude in nature was exactly what I wanted. The path was narrow and winding, and the trees, dense with their thick canopy of branches, blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving me to walk through patches of soft, wet earth and tangled roots. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant calls of birds. As I continued, I noticed the forest changing. The trees seemed older, more twisted. The path grew steeper, the rocks more uneven. I was getting higher up the mountain, and the air felt thinner. I stopped for a brief rest, sitting on a flat rock by the side of the trail. I took a swig of water, feeling the coldness slide down my throat. The stillness was overwhelming, and for the first time that day, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It was strange. Everything was as it had been before, but the silence felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and got back to my feet, continuing onward. The trail started to loop around the side of the mountain, and the slope became even steeper. I had to keep my balance carefully, using the trees and rocks for support. As I climbed higher, I began to see more of the valley below, and the view was breathtaking. But with every step, I felt the weight of the isolation sinking in. The forest seemed to close in on me, the sounds of the birds and rustling leaves gradually fading away. There was only the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dirt and gravel under my boots. About 4 hours into the hike, I reached a spot where the trail split into two directions. The sign was barely visible, half covered in moss and weathered by time. I had a map, but it was a bit outdated, and the paths didn't seem to match up with the markers. One trail veered off to the left, while the other continued straight ahead, winding deeper into the forest. I stood there for a moment trying to decide which way to go. The left path looked more overgrown, less traveled, but it seemed to head toward the next ridge. The straight path was more defined but didn't seem to lead anywhere in particular. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to take the left path. It was quieter here, more remote. The dense trees on either side seemed to close in, blocking out the sky. The ground was softer, and I had to watch where I stepped. The air felt colder here, and the shadows were deeper, more oppressive. I could tell that not many people had been down this trail in a while. I pressed on, the trail winding tighter, narrower. I was starting to feel the fatigue of the hike in my legs. I hadn't realized how much time had passed. The light was beginning to fade, the sun dipping behind the thick canopy above. My instincts told me I should turn back, but there was something about this path that intrigued me. Something about the way the forest seemed to embrace me, pulling me deeper into its silence. By the time I realized how far I had gone, the light had nearly disappeared. It was dusk now, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the trail. My phone had no signal, and I didn't have a flashlight with me. I had only a small headlamp in my pack, which I wasn't keen on using just yet. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew I had made a mistake. I was lost. The realization didn't panic me immediately, but a cold knot started to form in my stomach. I could feel the temperature dropping, the forest around me becoming more hostile. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but the trail seemed to have changed. The familiar landmarks were gone. The path no longer looked the same. What had once been a distinct trail was now nothing more than a series of indistinct paths, each leading to nowhere. My heart rate picked up. The cold air didn't help the rising sense of unease that was creeping through me. I had no choice but to keep moving. I took a deep breath and kept walking, hoping the trail would eventually open up again, but it didn't. The trees around me felt suffocating now, their branches twisted and gnarled like old, arthritic hands. I paused again, listening for any sounds of life, but there was nothing, just silence. The birds, the rustling leaves, everything was gone. The emptiness was suffocating. I was getting desperate now. I kept moving, faster, the unease in my chest growing with each step. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper in the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was distant, just on the edge of hearing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The forest had become far too quiet. I scanned the trees around me, my breath coming faster now. I was alone, I told myself. I had to be. There was no one else here. Yet the sound persisted. It was a rustling, like footsteps, but not quite right. Too light, too soft. I turned sharply, trying to peer through the thick foliage, but I saw nothing. My pulse raced as I stood still, straining my ears to hear. The sound was gone, but the feeling remained. That creeping sense of being watched, of being followed. I forced myself to move again, pushing through the underbrush. The trail was still nowhere to be seen. My feet were aching, and the cold was seeping through my clothes. I reached into my pack and pulled out the headlamp, flicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far, just a little too unnaturally. At that moment, I realized I had made a fatal error. I had wandered too far off course, deeper into a part of the forest that I didn't recognize. This was no longer just a hike, it was survival. The fear that had been simmering at the edges of my mind suddenly boiled over. I had to get out, and I had to do it now. I turned back the way I had come, my footsteps hurried and panicked. I didn't care about the path anymore. I just needed to find anything that could lead me back to safety. I was no longer thinking straight, just moving on instinct. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, sent my heart into my throat. The shadows seemed to close in on me, and I fought the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm me. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw something. A break in the canopy, a glimpse of the sky. It was the first clear opening I'd seen in hours. I pushed forward, desperate. My legs were stiff, my breath coming in short bursts. The light from my headlamp danced on the wet ground, and I saw the outline of a large rock in front of me. I rushed toward it, feeling the ground shift beneath me. And then, finally, the trail appeared again. It was a relief that washed over me like a wave. The path was still overgrown, but it was there, unmistakable. I followed it without hesitation, not daring to look back. The rustling noises had stopped. The forest had returned to its unnerving stillness, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get back. It was a slow journey back, but I didn't stop to rest. The fear that had gripped me earlier still lingered, but now, with the trail beneath my feet, I felt a sense of control returning. The forest no longer felt like a threat, just a place I needed to navigate through. The sky above was darkening fast, but I had a sense of direction now. I could hear the sounds of the outside world again. The wind in the trees, the calls of distant animals. I wasn't alone anymore. When I finally reached the clearing near the base of the mountain, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The moon was rising, and the air was cold but clear. I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me, but it was the kind of relief that only comes when you've made it through something terrifying and come out the other side. I hadn't just hiked that trail, I had survived it. The air was still, the kind of stillness that blankets everything around you. No wind, no movement, just the steady hum of the forest. It was early morning, and I had set off from the trailhead by myself, something I had done many times before. This was supposed to be a routine hike, just a few hours out in the woods to clear my mind, escape the stresses of daily life. But by the end of the day, I would realize how wrong I had been, how dangerously wrong I had been. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the trail. The forest was dense, thick with pines and oaks, their dark trunks contrasting sharply with the vibrant greens of the moss and ferns that blanketed the forest floor. Birds called out from the trees, and a distant rustling told me that small animals were moving in the underbrush. The trail was narrow but well-worn, clearly marked with signs and faded paint on the trees. At first, it felt peaceful. I'd been here before, familiar with the way the trail wound through the trees, the way it climbed in steep, twisting sections, only to flatten out again before the next hill. I had no intention of pushing myself too hard. This wasn't meant to be a difficult hike, but something about this morning felt different. The air, despite its freshness, seemed thicker somehow, as though it were holding its breath. I kept walking, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. My boots crunched softly on the trail, the sound of the forest just slightly muffled, as if it was distant, separated from me by something I couldn't quite name. There was no particular reason for it, no obvious threat, just an odd feeling, a weight in the air that didn't belong. The further I went, the more I noticed the small changes around me. The trail, once well-defined, began to grow fainter, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. The trees pressed closer, their trunks dark and thick, and the brush on either side of the trail grew dense and tangled. It felt like the forest was closing in, and I had to push through the thickening undergrowth just to keep moving forward. I checked my watch. It was barely an hour into the hike. I shrugged it off, told myself that maybe I was just imagining things. It wasn't uncommon for the forest to feel oppressive like this. After all, I was alone out here, and the isolation could make everything seem a little bit more intense than it really was. I had a map and a compass. I wasn't worried about getting lost, but I did feel alone, more alone than I had expected. Eventually, I came to a fork in the trail, a place where the path split into two directions. I checked the map, but there was no clear indication of which one was the right path to follow. I had remembered the layout of the trailhead, but now nothing seemed quite as familiar as it had before. I had always trusted my sense of direction, but now doubt crept in. The trees seemed to shift, their dark silhouettes becoming more like shadows, and I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. One path seemed to veer off to the left, winding deeper into the forest, while the other headed uphill. The map indicated that the summit trail was to the right, so I chose that path, hoping that my sense of direction wasn't failing me. But something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. Was I sure? I started walking up the hill, pushing through thick branches that scraped at my face, my hands brushing against the rough bark of the trees. The trail was steeper now, the climb more intense, and soon I was breathing harder. I took a swig from my water bottle, wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, and kept moving. Every now and then, I'd look back to see how far I'd come, but the view behind me was just a blur of green, nothing but a wall of trees. Time passed in strange, uneven intervals. The minutes seemed to stretch out longer than they should have. and with each step, the uneasy feeling grew. It was as if something were watching me, something just outside of my field of vision, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone on this trail anymore. I told myself it was just the isolation, that it was the quiet, that the forest was playing tricks on me. But it didn't feel like just that. Then, without warning, the forest became silent. No birds, no rustling of animals, nothing. Just silence. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My heartbeat quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked around, trying to figure out what was wrong, but there was nothing. No reason for the sudden silence, no explanation for why the forest had fallen completely still. It felt unnatural, like something was holding its breath, waiting. I started walking again, but faster now, my steps more hurried. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps. Still nothing, just the trees, the dense underbrush, and the path ahead. But the silence was oppressive, a weight in the air that pressed against my chest. As I pushed through the trees, the path narrowed even more, and the foliage thickened. It was harder to see the trail now, harder to keep my bearings. The slope was steeper, and I was starting to feel the strain in my legs, the weariness setting in. But I had to keep moving forward. I wasn't turning back, couldn't. And then I saw it, a flash of movement, quick and dark, darting just ahead of me between the trees. My heart lurched. I froze, staring ahead, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I hadn't imagined it. Something had moved, something large and fast. A deer, maybe? A bear? I wasn't sure, but I was certain that I wasn't alone anymore. Panic gripped me. I hadn't heard it approach, hadn't noticed it until it was right there, just out of sight. Slowly, cautiously, I took a step forward, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. The silence was back, even heavier than before. I could feel the tension in my body, the cold sweat trickling down my back. I wanted to turn around and run, but I didn't know if that would make things worse. I wasn't even sure if running would do any good. The woods were dense, the underbrush thick, and the path steep and winding. There was no guarantee I could outrun whatever had been watching me. For a long moment, I stood there, frozen, waiting for the next movement, for the next sound. But there was nothing. Not a breath of wind, not a crack of twigs underfoot. Just the forest, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, as if the weight had lifted, the forest came back to life. Birds started calling again, a rustle of leaves from the underbrush. The silence was broken. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had just happened. Was I imagining things? Had I really seen something move? Or had my mind played a trick on me? I glanced around one last time before deciding to keep going. The path seemed to level off ahead, and I was desperate to reach the summit, to feel some sense of accomplishment. But as I pushed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, it was hard to tell. Time seemed to stretch in strange ways. But eventually, I reached the top. The summit trail opened up into a clearing, a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the air was warmer, a welcome contrast to the chill of the forest below. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the feeling of unease hadn't left. It lingered, just beneath the surface, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation, the strange feeling of being watched, or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the only one who had been on that trail today. As I sat there on the rocks, overlooking the valley, I heard it again. The faintest sound, a footstep or something else. It was impossible to tell. But this time I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew what was out there now, and I wasn't about to make the mistake of looking back. The descent was uneventful, and when I reached the trailhead, I could finally breathe easy. My car was still there, parked in the same spot as if nothing had happened. I didn't know if I was just overthinking things or if I had actually been followed. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to hike alone again for a long time. It wasn't until I got home that I checked my gear. My compass had gone missing. I had been planning the hike for months. I wanted to take some quiet time for myself, escape the city, and capture some untouched nature with my camera. It was early spring, and the snow had just finished melting in the higher elevations. I picked a spot deep in the forest, about 6 hours away from the nearest town, a place hardly visited by anyone. It was remote, but that's what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just trees, birds, and peace. I packed carefully. I brought my DSLR, batteries, tripod, extra SD cards, freeze-dried meals, a gas stove, a bear canister, and a first aid kit. I had checked the weather report several times. Clear skies for the next week. Perfect. I left my car at the trailhead and started the hike in around 7 a.m. The trail wasn't well maintained past a certain point, but I liked that. I followed an old logging path that branched off into the deeper parts of the forest, where the trees got taller and thicker. I barely saw any litter or footprints. I felt like the only person out there. The first night was fine. I pitched my tent near a small creek, cooked some noodles, and spent the evening photographing the moss-covered rocks along the water. The silence was almost deafening, but in a good way. That kind of stillness is rare. I fell asleep fast that night. I started hiking again after breakfast. My goal was to get to a high clearing I had marked on my map. There was supposed to be a great view of the valley below. About 5 hours in, I wandered a bit off my planned route because I saw a narrow game trail leading toward a cluster of boulders that looked interesting. It wasn't on my map, but it felt right. It was just sitting there, maybe 20 feet from the base of a big rock. The fabric looked weather-resistant and relatively new. It wasn't sun-bleached or torn, and it had been staked down tightly. There were no signs of distress around it. It didn't make sense. There was no campsite marked on any maps nearby. I crouched down and looked closer. The zipper was closed, but the tracks around it, if you could even call them that, looked like they had been partially brushed away. Almost deliberately. There was no backpack outside, no shoes, no food wrappers, not even a fire ring. Just a well-placed tent sitting in a silent patch of woods. I didn't want to touch anything. I stepped around it, taking photos, thinking maybe someone had gotten lost or decided to camp off-grid. But the weird thing was, there were no sounds around it. No birds, no insects. I hadn't realized how quiet it had gotten until I walked away from it and heard the rustling of leaves again. I should have turned back. Instead, I set up my own camp a few hundred yards away on slightly higher ground. I told myself it was fine, probably just another hiker who left it for a later trip. Maybe even a ranger stash. Still, I felt uneasy. After dinner, I sat in my tent, looking through my camera. Some of the shots of the boulders turned out great. I zoomed in on the tent in one of them. Something looked off like the flap had moved a little since I last saw it. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. Then I noticed it. No sound again. The crickets had gone quiet. Not even wind in the trees. Just complete silence. I sat up and checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear twigs snapping. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't explain it. It was like a shift in pressure, like someone holding their breath nearby. I stayed frozen like that for over an hour, not even daring to unzip the door and look outside. In the morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped out slowly. I looked toward the area where the other tent was. I walked down to the spot. No drag marks, no signs of pack-up. Just a flat patch of grass and a circle of disturbed pine needles where the stakes had been. Now I started to feel panic. Whoever had put it there had come back during the night. Why would someone take it down at 2 in the morning? Why not wait until daylight? And why hide all traces of being there? I didn't waste time. I packed everything quickly, skipped breakfast, and started heading back toward the trail. I tried to follow my GPS, but the signal was weak in this part of the forest. I ended up backtracking to the logging road I had used earlier. But something was wrong again. I saw footprints, several sets. Too big to be mine, too spaced out. Heavy boots. They weren't following the road. They were following me. I kept walking faster now. The trail was uneven, and I slipped several times. I was sweating even though the air was still cold. I stopped for a few minutes to drink water, and when I turned to look behind me, I swore I saw something duck behind a tree, but when I stared, it was just shadows. Still, I changed course, heading up a ridge I hadn't planned to climb. Took extra energy, but I wanted to break the line of sight. I didn't stop again until I was over the top and down the other side, in a thicker patch of trees. I stayed there for a long time, trying to be quiet, barely breathing. I didn't want to sleep in my tent that night. I found a downed tree near a dry wash and huddled under it with my sleeping bag. I didn't cook anything. I didn't even use my flashlight. I just waited. At some point, I heard snapping twigs nearby. This time I was sure. It wasn't an animal. It stopped and started. It circled. It was patient. I held my breath for what felt like an hour. Then it was gone again. The trail anymore. I went straight downhill, using the sun to guide me east. I fell more than once. My arms were scratched. I lost my tripod somewhere. My knee twisted when I stepped into a hole hidden under dead leaves. I pushed forward, limping. Eventually, I heard it. Asterisk, asterisk, a road, asterisk, asterisk. Cars. Not many, but it was real. I burst out of the tree line like a man crawling out of a grave. A pickup slowed down and the driver leaned out, asking if I was okay. I nodded. I said I just got lost. Needed a ride to the nearest town. He didn't ask questions. When we drove past the trailhead where my car was parked, I saw something chilling. A footprint in the dirt, right next to my driver's side door. The exact shape and size as the ones I'd seen in the woods. I never went back to that forest. I still have the photos I took on my camera, including the ones with the tent in the background. I checked with local authorities later. They said there hadn't been any camping permits filed for that area in months. No missing person reports either. But I know what I saw, and I know someone else was out there, moving quietly, erasing their trail, watching me. I still hike sometimes, but never alone, and never without letting someone know exactly where I'm going. I don't care how remote a place is supposed to be. There's always someone deeper in the woods, someone who doesn't want to be found. I had always been drawn to the quiet of nature, the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant rush of a stream had always been soothing to me. I didn't need much company, just the trail, the trees, and the open sky. It was mid-April when I decided to take a solo hike through the Shasta Trinity National Forest. I'd been on many hikes before, but nothing as ambitious as this one. I'd heard about a long, winding trail that cut through the heart of the forest, stretching over 30 miles, leading into a series of remote, untouched areas. People spoke about it in hushed tones, as though the trail itself was something sacred. I didn't believe in superstitions, but the idea of hiking through such an isolated place intrigued me. The morning I set out, the weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just a hint of chill in the air. I packed light but smart: water, a first aid kit, a small stove with fuel, snacks, and a thermal blanket. I had a map of the trail, a compass, and enough gear to last for at least 2 days. I knew the trail was supposed to be challenging, but I was confident in my ability. The first few hours were nothing but peaceful, idyllic wilderness. The air was fresh, and the trail wound through thick trees and over uneven terrain. The deeper I went, the less familiar it became, but the sense of peace I felt kept me going. It was almost like the forest was absorbing me, taking me into its rhythm. By noon, I reached the first water crossing. It wasn't a river or stream, just a small, shallow creek trickling over rocks. The water was clear, the sound calming. I stopped for a moment to fill my bottle, taking a few long sips. I felt refreshed, as though the very water I was drinking was part of the forest's energy. I moved on, but the trail began to feel steeper as I went. The path narrowed in some spots, forcing me to climb over rocks or duck under thick branches. The sun was high by this point, and though the morning had been cold, the afternoon was beginning to warm up. I wiped the sweat from my forehead as I pushed onward, making good progress despite the challenging terrain. But then the atmosphere began to change. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but the air seemed to shift. It wasn't anything I could describe with certainty, just a feeling of something off. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. Even the rustling of the leaves seemed quieter. My steps, once accompanied by the sounds of the forest, now echoed strangely in the silence. It wasn't exactly eerie, but there was a definite heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. I shrugged it off as just my imagination. I was, after all, miles deep into the forest, alone in an area few people visited. It was only natural for the environment to feel a bit different. I kept walking. The trail began to take me uphill, and I had to pay closer attention to where I placed my feet. The rocks were loose in places, and I nearly slipped a couple of times, but my boots gripped well enough. After a while, I stopped to take a short break. I leaned against a boulder, taking a moment to catch my breath and drink some water. It was then that I noticed something strange. Up ahead, the trail appeared to split, but it wasn't a typical fork. It was subtle. The ground just seemed to curve in two directions. I peered into the shadows between the trees where the path disappeared. Felt wrong. I can't explain it, but there was a certain energy in that area, an unease that spread across my skin like a cold draft. Despite the odd feeling, I chose to follow the path that veered to the left. The other one just felt too strange to trust, too overgrown. I figured the trail I was on would lead me to a clearing, or maybe even to a campsite where I could rest for the night. The more I walked, though, the more unsettling things became. The trees felt denser, closer together. The underbrush grew thicker, the branches of the trees interwoven above, blocking out the sun. It was suddenly darker, even though it was still afternoon. I pushed on, but my pace slowed. The weight of the silence began to press on me. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I ignored them, convinced I was just being paranoid. Then, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. There was an old, decaying structure partially hidden by thick vines and moss. It looked like a cabin, though it was nothing more than a frame now. The roof caved in, the walls rotted away. There was no sign of recent habitation, no obvious path leading to it. Just an old, abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. I didn't approach it at first. I kept my distance, watching from the tree line. My heart raced. What was this place doing here? It felt out of place, like it shouldn't belong. But then my curiosity took over, and I made my way closer. As I neared, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A single pair of boots, discarded by the doorframe. They were old, their soles worn, the laces frayed. I froze. It wasn't just the boots. The air seemed even thicker now, the smell of decay stronger. I looked around, scanning the area, but there was no sign of life, no movement. I debated what to do. My gut was telling me to leave, but I had already come this far. Maybe the cabin had been abandoned for years. Maybe it was just an old relic of someone's past. I slowly moved closer to the cabin. The door frame was partially collapsed, but it still held enough of a structure to suggest it had once been lived in. I peered inside. The place was bare. Nothing but dust, rotting wood, and the remnants of something long forgotten. But then I saw something on the floor, a small pile of fresh dirt. It looked out of place in the otherwise abandoned cabin. It hadn't been there for long, I was sure of it. My blood ran cold. I immediately stepped back, my mind racing. Someone had been here recently, but who and why? I turned to leave, but as I did, a movement caught my eye. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, I saw something, a figure. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was a person. They stood still, watching me. For a moment, I thought I imagined it, but then the figure shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. My heart pounded. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted through the forest, my legs burning, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't dare look back. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own footsteps and the rustling of branches as I tore through the underbrush. I wasn't sure if I was still on the trail. The world around me felt like a blur of green, a wall of trees and leaves, and the steady thudding of my heart in my chest. The ground beneath me began to slope downward, and I realized I was heading toward the creek where I had stopped earlier. My only thought was to get back to the water, to any sign of civilization. If I could just make it back to that stream, I would have a chance. My legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, adrenaline propelling me forward. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it, the presence in the forest, the unknown threat lurking somewhere just out of sight. When I reached the creek, I stopped, gasping for air. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to steady myself. The sound of the water was a welcome relief, its gentle babbling drowning out the fear pounding in my head. I stood there for a moment, listening. Everything was still again. I was alone. I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay at the creek forever. The sun was lowering in the sky, and I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The forest could be dangerous, especially after dark. But I wasn't going back to that cabin. I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and checked my map. The trail was still several miles ahead, but at least now I knew where I was. I wasn't lost, but I didn't know if I could shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I kept walking carefully now, more aware of my surroundings than ever before. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The hike didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It felt like a race against something I couldn't see. And when I finally reached the end of the trail that evening, I didn't feel a sense of relief. I felt exhausted, drained, and unsettled. I never did find out who or what had been in that forest with me that day. But the experience taught me something about the wilderness. It was far more unpredictable than I had ever imagined. And some places are better left undisturbed. I had always enjoyed hiking. There was something about the quiet of the forest, the fresh air, and the challenge of the trail that pulled me in. It was just me and my gear, nothing else to distract me from the rhythm of my steps and the sound of the world around me. It wasn't until I decided to hike alone in the backcountry that things took a turn I wasn't prepared for. I planned the trip for weeks. I'd been eyeing a trail that snaked through some of the most remote wilderness areas in the region. It wasn't well known, and the solitude was what attracted me. I wanted to get away from everything, no phone service, no distractions, just nature. The day I left, the sky was a perfect shade of blue, and the sun hung high in the sky, providing just enough warmth without it being oppressive. The trail started easily, winding through dense woods that were just beginning to turn with the colors of autumn. The leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way along the path. I felt a sense of calm, of peace, something I hadn't felt in a while. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, and though it was steep in places, I was in good shape and the fresh air gave me the energy to keep going. I passed a few other hikers early on, but by noon, I found myself completely alone. The trail stretched before me, disappearing into the trees, leading deeper into the wilderness. I paused for a quick break at a clearing. I pulled out my water bottle, taking a sip and eating a small snack. The quiet of the forest was almost too much at times. There wasn't a bird call, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. I shrugged it off. I'd been out here before, and this was part of the experience. As I pressed on, the trail began to narrow, the trees becoming thicker, the underbrush denser. It was still well marked, but the deeper I went, the more I realized that I hadn't seen another person in hours. The thought didn't really scare me. It just made me more aware of the isolation I was in. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The view from the top was breathtaking. I could see the expanse of the forest below me, the way the trees stretched out like an ocean of green. I took a few minutes to just stand there, soaking it in, before continuing. The trail on the other side of the ridge was much less defined. The map I had showed it as a rough trail that led down toward a creek. It wasn't as well marked as the first part, but I figured I could handle it. The sun had now disappeared, and the light was fading fast. I knew I had to pick up the pace if I wanted to make it to the creek before dark. The forest here felt different. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had grown used to. There was a subtle tension in the air, a quiet heaviness. I tried not to think too much about it and focused on the path. But as I continued, I began to notice something odd. The trees were closer together, their branches intertwining, casting deep shadows. The air had a chill to it, and despite my steady pace, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. I stopped to check my map. I had followed the trail markings well enough, but now it seemed like the trail was getting harder to follow. There were no more obvious markers, no signs, just a narrow path carved through thick underbrush. It didn't feel like a maintained trail anymore, but I convinced myself it was just a part of the adventure. The further I went, the less the trail seemed to make sense. It started to branch off in several directions, none of them particularly clear. It had become dark now, the dimming light only adding to the eerie feeling I couldn't shake. I checked my watch, 7:30 p.m. The daylight had vanished completely. That's when I heard it. A snap. The sound of a twig breaking, distant but clear. I froze. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit. But there was something about the sound that didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too sharp. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the sound of my breathing, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of another branch breaking. I shook my head. Just your imagination, I whispered to myself. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap of a twig. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I stood there for a long moment, not moving, trying to listen. Whoever or whatever was out there was keeping their distance. I couldn't hear footsteps, just the occasional crack of a branch. My mind raced. I was isolated out here. There was no cell service, no one else for miles. If something went wrong, I was on my own. I started walking again. Faster now, my mind spinning with possibilities. I needed to find the creek. If I could reach water, I would be able to set up camp, and I could figure out what to do next. But every time I took a step, I felt the presence of someone or something behind me, a prickling on the back of my neck, an unsettling feeling that I wasn't the only one on the trail. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, but there was never anyone there. Still, the feeling of being watched remained, like invisible eyes were tracking my every move. The forest had grown darker still. The path was now barely visible, and I had to rely on my flashlight to guide me. My hands were shaking. I needed to calm down. I needed to focus. There was nothing to be afraid of, I told myself. But then I stumbled. I caught myself on a tree, but when I looked up, I realized I had lost the path entirely. I was standing in the middle of dense brush with no trail markers in sight. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I feared it was going to die, but it flickered back on. That's when I heard it again, the snap of a twig, closer than before. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was out there. I had no choice but to keep moving. I pushed through the underbrush, the bushes grabbing at my clothes, the leaves brushing against my skin. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced as I tried to find my bearings. My headlamp illuminated nothing but shadows, and I had the distinct feeling that whatever was out there was closing in on me. The silence in the woods felt oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard a voice, a distant shout, not loud but enough to send a wave of panic through me. It was a human voice, but it wasn't clear, wasn't words, just a sound. My stomach dropped. This was no longer a random animal. It was a person, and they were not far from me. I turned in the direction of the shout, trying to make out any movement in the darkness. I started to run. My feet stumbled over the uneven ground, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I had no idea where the creek was anymore. I just had to get out of there. I ran until my breath came in ragged gasps, until my legs burned from the effort. Suddenly, I tripped again. My foot caught on a hidden root, and I went crashing to the ground, the flashlight spinning from my hand and coming to a stop several feet away. The world went dark. I lay there, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I couldn't hear anything at all. I got to my feet slowly, my body stiff with fear, and crawled toward my flashlight. When I turned it back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the distance, was a figure, a man standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. I froze. My mind went blank. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. The man didn't move. He just stood there, still as a statue, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the light of my flashlight. I turned and ran, sprinting as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't know how far I ran, or for how long, but eventually, I stumbled onto a gravel road. I kept running, not stopping until I finally reached a campsite with a few tents. There were people there. I collapsed in front of them, gasping for air, unable to say a word. They helped me, gave me water, and called for help. Later, when I was finally able to explain what had happened, the police went out into the woods to investigate. They never found anyone, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. I never hiked alone in those woods again. It wasn't the trees or the trail that scared me. It was the knowledge that sometimes, in the middle of the wild, you're not alone. I had always loved hiking, the solitude, the fresh air, the satisfaction of making it to the top of a mountain or the base of a waterfall. It all made the effort worth it. It was my escape from the noise of everyday life, a time when I could just be alone with my thoughts. It wasn't unusual for me to take off on weekend trips into the wild, especially in the fall when the leaves were changing, and the air had that crispness to it. This trip, however, would turn into something I'd never forget. I had decided to hike a trail I hadn't done before. It was a bit remote, which was exactly what I wanted, less crowded, more peaceful. The trailhead was at the edge of a small town in the foothills of the mountains, and the path was said to lead deep into the forest, where it split into several smaller trails that looped back to the main route. My map showed the trail would take about 6 hours to complete, so I packed enough water, snacks, and supplies for a full day. I started early, as I always do, wanting to get through the tough parts before the sun was at its highest. The first part of the hike was easy, with a gentle incline that wound through towering pines and maples. The morning was still cool, and a soft fog hung around the trunks of the trees, making everything feel a bit surreal. Birds were starting to wake up, their calls echoing through the quiet woods. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was lost in the beauty of it all, lost in the rhythm of my steps. About 2 hours into the hike, the trail began to get steeper. The path narrowed, and the ground became uneven with roots poking out of the dirt. It wasn't hard to navigate, but it was slow going. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching my footing, trying not to slip or trip. The trees had thinned a bit, and sunlight streamed down in thin rays, making the forest floor look like a patchwork of light and shadow. I could hear the distant sound of running water, but I didn't know if it was a stream or something further off. As I moved forward, I noticed something strange. There were no other hikers. It wasn't unusual to hike alone, but I hadn't seen anyone since the trailhead, not even from a distance. The trail was supposed to be popular, or at least decently traveled, but for the last hour, there had been no signs of human life. No footprints, no discarded water bottles, no rustling in the bushes that might suggest an animal was nearby. It was starting to feel too quiet, and I wasn't sure why, but it made me uneasy. I paused for a moment, wiped the sweat from my brow, and drank from my water bottle. There was something off about the place, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced around at the trees, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I brushed it off as just my mind getting carried away, as it sometimes did when I was alone in the woods for too long. I pushed on, reminding myself that I was here for a good time. The trail eventually split into 2 smaller paths. One was a sharp incline that looked like it would take me to a vantage point at the top of a ridge. The other veered off to the left and seemed to lead deeper into the woods, following the sound of the running water I had been hearing. I decided to take the second option, thinking I'd check out the stream and maybe find a good spot to rest. The trail became more rugged as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees were close together now, their branches thick with leaves, blocking out much of the sunlight. The forest floor was softer, the ground more uneven. The sound of the stream grew louder, and soon I was walking alongside it, the water rushing over rocks. The coolness of the air near the water was a relief after the climb, and I found myself enjoying the sound of the current, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional bird call. But then something changed. The water was no longer just a peaceful sound in the background. It had become an almost oppressive rush. As I walked along the stream, the trees began to get denser. The trail started to feel less like a trail and more like a path that had been worn into the earth by animals or the occasional lost hiker. The underbrush was thick with brambles and ferns, and I had to step carefully, trying to avoid getting tangled. The quiet seemed to deepen, and I felt that unease creeping back. Then, out of nowhere, the air shifted. It was a sudden change, a drop in temperature that sent a shiver down my spine. The chill wasn't just from the water, it felt almost like a breeze, but there was no wind. The trees seemed to shift, their branches creaking and groaning in a way that made my skin crawl. I stopped and looked around, my heart pounding a little faster. It was as though something had just changed, though I couldn't say exactly what. At that moment, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bird taking flight, but there was nothing. No animal, no rustling leaves, no sign of movement, just the thick, oppressive silence of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The path ahead seemed darker, as though the trees had closed in even more. My instincts were telling me to turn around, to go back the way I came, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to turn back now. I was close to the water, and I figured I could find a good spot to sit by the stream for a while, catch my breath, and take in the scenery. As I walked further, the noise of the stream grew louder. It wasn't the pleasant sound of a babbling brook anymore. It was the sound of rushing water, crashing over rocks, almost like a roar. And yet, I couldn't see it. The trees were so thick, and the trail was so narrow that I couldn't see the water anymore. The sound of it, though, was overwhelming, and it made my stomach churn. Then I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I blinked and squinted, I realized it was something else. A dark shape, crouched in the brush near the stream. It was still, unnaturally still. It was so out of place in this wilderness, so wrong. My heart started to race, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. The urge to run, to flee, overwhelmed me. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back down the trail. My breath came in quick, sharp gasps as I crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the branches scratching my arms or the rocks that made me stumble. The sound of the rushing water behind me was deafening, but I didn't look back. I just ran. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the fork in the trail where I had made my decision to head toward the stream. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't even hesitate. I turned down the path that led back toward the trailhead, knowing I needed to get out of those woods as quickly as possible. The return trip felt different. The forest around me seemed even darker now, the shadows thicker, and the air colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something was following me. I kept hearing the rustling of leaves, but each time I turned, there was nothing. When I finally reached the trailhead, I didn't even look back. I just kept walking, out of that forest and back into the town where I felt safe. I don't know what I saw or what was following me, but something was there. It took me a long time to shake the feeling of unease, to be able to sleep without feeling like someone was watching me. I never went back to that trail, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever it was, whatever I encountered out there, it's not something I want to face again. I took time off work in early September, packed my hiking gear, and drove out to the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. It wasn't my first solo hike, but I hadn't been on a long one since last spring, and I felt that itch to get out again. I planned a 5-day loop that would take me deep into the backcountry, far from cell service, roads, or even popular trails. I liked it that way. I wasn't going for views or social media pictures. I just wanted quiet, space, and time away from people. I packed light but careful. My tent, a compact sleeping bag, food for 6 days just in case, a small gas stove, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, GPS tracker, map, compass, and a fixed blade knife I always took into the woods. I had done this kind of thing before, so I knew what to expect. I left a detailed route with my brother, told him I'd check in once I got back to the main road on day 5. and drove to the trailhead near Painted Rocks Lake. The first 2 days went smoothly. The trail was overgrown in some places, but I kept up a steady pace, hiking close to 10 miles each day. I camped near streams, filtered my water, cooked quick meals, and kept everything clean and packed. The nights were cold and quiet. I didn't see anyone, no other hikers, no hunters, just birds during the day and the occasional rustle in the underbrush at night. The kind that comes from deer or squirrels, I figured. That's how it usually is. On the third day, the air started to feel heavier. I don't mean the weather, though clouds did roll in later that afternoon, but the woods themselves felt different. I was deep enough into the backcountry that human signs had vanished entirely. No boot prints, no wrappers, no cut branches. That wasn't strange, just something I noticed. I followed a faint trail through a thick pine forest that sloped downward. Around noon, I stopped to eat and rest near a clearing. That's when I saw it. A mound of rocks at the base of a tree caught my eye. Not natural. They were stacked carefully, like someone had built a little pile on purpose. Maybe a marker, maybe a cairn. I got up, walked over, and squatted down to look. There was a stick in the center of the pile, stuck upright in the dirt. I brushed a few rocks aside, just curious, and that's when I found the camera. It was a small black handheld one, the kind hikers sometimes bring. It looked dusty, maybe water damaged. One corner had cracked. I turned it over in my hands. The memory card slot was closed. No name on it, no strap. I hesitated, thinking it might belong to someone who wanted to come back for it. But the way it was buried, under stacked rocks, it didn't seem like an accident. I slipped it into the side pouch of my pack and put the rocks back how they were. I made camp a few miles away from that spot, farther down the slope near a small stream. I didn't open the camera that night. I cooked, ate, stretched my legs, and zipped into my sleeping bag once the sun dipped below the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear any frogs or insects, just the stream gurgling. I barely slept. Not because of the camera, not exactly. Just something about the silence. The next morning, I pulled the memory card from the camera and slotted it into my small waterproof digital viewer. I always carried it with me in case I wanted to dump my own SD cards, and it powered on fine. The camera's battery was dead, but the card was intact. It had 138 files on it, mostly video clips and a few photos. The first video was someone hiking through thick woods. The footage was shaky, and the sound was muffled. Whoever was filming wasn't talking, just moving through trees. I skipped through a few clips. They were all like that. Different locations, all in the woods. No faces, no narration. Just walking, sometimes breathing heavily. Some clips were taken at night, but I could barely see anything in the dark. One video showed a deer in the distance, standing perfectly still, eyes glowing in the lens. Then static. I almost stopped watching, but around the 80th clip, the tone changed. The person filming had come across what looked like a tattered backpack on the forest floor. The camera zoomed in slowly. Torn straps, dirt smudges. No blood, just abandoned gear. Then more clips followed of other odd things. A boot lodged between rocks, a knife half buried in moss, an empty tent flattened and covered with leaves. Every item looked weathered, like it had been there for months. The last video showed something that made my stomach twist. The camera was placed on the ground, aimed up toward trees. It was night. A fire burned in the background, barely in view. The person walked in front of the lens, just legs and boots, then stood still. Minutes passed. Then a second person entered the frame, crouched beside the fire. This one had a large pack and something that looked like a tarp. The two figures didn't speak. They just stood there. One turned toward the camera and walked forward slowly, like they knew it was there. The video cut off as the figure's boots filled the frame. I shut the viewer off and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe staged, maybe old, maybe some backwoods project someone abandoned. But deep down, it didn't feel that way. The video had a realness to it, something raw. The way the camera moved, the pacing, the silence. It felt like whoever filmed that didn't plan to be found. I almost left the camera behind that morning, just put it back under the rocks. But something in me said to take it out with me and give it to someone later. I didn't want to erase it. I didn't want to forget it either. I changed my route. Instead of completing the full loop, I decided to cut north toward a service road marked on my map. It would shave a day off the trip, and I figured that was smart, just in case. The clouds thickened that afternoon, and light rain started to fall. I picked up the pace, checking my GPS every mile. But the trail was slower than I expected. Wet roots, thick brush, and a steep ridge I hadn't noticed on the topographic map. I set up camp that night on a rocky flat halfway up the ridge, trying to stay dry under a tarp I rigged between two boulders. My tent wouldn't hold on the slope. The rain got heavier. I barely ate. My stomach was twisted. Around midnight, I heard a crack, like a branch snapping, then silence. I held my breath. No wind, just dripping rain and that one sharp sound still ringing in my memory. I stayed still for hours, my knife in hand. I didn't sleep. By morning, the rain had stopped. I packed up quickly and climbed to the ridge's top. From there, I could see a long valley below and, in the far distance, a narrow line that might have been the old service road. I started down the other side, picking my way slowly through loose gravel and wet pine needles. Halfway down the valley, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud. Not animal, not mine. Boot prints, deep, recent. I froze. They were going the same direction I was headed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe hunters, maybe another hiker. But in that part of the Bitterroots that far out, it didn't add up. I moved slower after that, stopping often to listen. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The prints stayed ahead of me for the next few miles. Then they vanished near a bend in the trail. I kept going. By the time I reached the road, it was late afternoon. The road was barely more than a dirt path, washed out in parts and overgrown. I followed it east for several hours until I found a forestry marker nailed to a tree. A quarter-mile past that, I got cell service for the first time in 4 days. I texted my brother, told him I was out early, told him I was okay. He didn't reply. I kept walking. A few hours later, I reached a gravel lot where I'd planned to stash a bike for the last leg of the loop. I had locked it to a tree. It was still there. No signs anyone had touched it. I biked 12 miles down the gravel road to where my truck was parked. Everything was as I'd left it. I didn't breathe easy until I was 30 miles down the highway, back near the small town where I'd fueled up 5 days before. I turned the camera and the memory card in to the local ranger station. The guy at the desk didn't ask many questions. He just took it and nodded. I gave my name, number, and coordinates where I'd found it. A week later, I got a call from a Forest Service investigator. He asked for a few more details. I told him everything, how I found it, what was on it, how the trip had gone. He asked if I'd seen anyone out there. I said no. Then he asked if I still had the GPS track from my route. I did. I emailed it to him. 2 days after that, he called again and said something strange. He told me the footage matched some open cases from the past 2 years. Disappearances. One was a solo hiker. Another was a couple who vanished last fall. Their vehicle had been found at a trailhead, but no trace after that. He didn't say much else. Just thanked me again. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been back out on trails, but I don't camp alone anymore. I keep my hikes short, closer to towns. I carry more than just bear spray, and I've started taking I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything major, just a couple of days on a remote trail I'd heard about through a forum. A solo adventure to clear my head, a chance to unwind and reconnect with nature. I'd read enough about the trail to know it would be challenging but manageable, nothing out of the ordinary. The morning I set out was perfect. Clear skies, the air cool but not too cold, and the kind of quiet you only find when you're out of the city, away from the hum of cars and distant voices. The sun had just begun to rise, and I felt that familiar rush of excitement you get when you're starting a journey. The trailhead was tucked away at the edge of a forest, hidden behind some dense undergrowth. I had parked my truck at a nearby camping site, and after a quick check of my gear, water, snacks, a map of the trail, and a first aid kit, I headed into the woods. The path was narrow at first, barely wide enough for one person. Trees stood tall around me, their trunks rough and weathered, their canopies thick enough to block out most of the sunlight. For the first few hours, it was all just the usual stuff you expect from a hike: steady walking, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the occasional rustling from animals in the bushes. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of the quietness pressing down on me. There wasn't a single other soul on the trail, and while that was part of the appeal, I also started to feel the isolation settling in. Around noon, I found a spot by a small creek to take a break. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I sat on a rock, eating a sandwich and watching the water flow by, letting my mind wander. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I realized I hadn't seen any animals. Normally, you'd see something, a squirrel, maybe a deer, some birds in the trees, but there was nothing. It felt strange, but I shrugged it off. Nature doesn't always follow the script. I packed up and continued on. The trail grew steeper as I climbed higher, winding its way up the side of a mountain. The forest thinned out a bit, the trees more spaced apart, and the rocks underfoot began to make the going a little more difficult. My breathing became heavier as I pushed myself up, sweat beading on my forehead. I could feel the burn in my legs, the kind of burn that tells you you're making progress. It was after I passed the halfway mark that things started to feel off. I don't know exactly when it began, but I started to notice subtle signs that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything concrete, just little things at first. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself had thickened, the kind of feeling you get when a storm's coming, even if the sky above is clear. The sounds of nature had started to fade, too. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves. Everything had become unnervingly silent. I paused for a moment, standing still on the trail, trying to shake off the unease that had crept up on me. I hadn't heard anything for the past few minutes. No breeze, no rustling, no distant bird calls. It was as if the whole world had stopped moving. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a strange twinge in my gut, the kind of instinctive feeling that something was wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just tired, or the altitude was getting to me. I took a deep breath and kept moving, but the quiet kept pressing in on me, suffocating in a way that made me want to turn around and head back down. But I didn't. I told myself that it was just nerves, just the isolation starting to get to me. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. It wasn't long before I reached the summit. The view from the top was everything I'd hoped for. Sprawling forests stretching out in every direction, mountains rising in the distance, and the kind of clarity you only get when you're standing at the highest point for miles around. I took a moment to enjoy the view, taking in the beauty of the scene before sitting down to rest. That's when I heard the noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination. A small crack of a twig snapping, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then it came again, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of something moving in the woods. Something big. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to listen. I didn't see anything at first, but I could feel the tension building, the sense that something was out there, just beyond my sight. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt the first real pang of fear. The sound came again, this time much closer. It was like the heavy footfalls of something large moving through the underbrush, deliberate and slow. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stood up slowly, my body tense, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the hiking pole I'd been using. I had no idea what was out there, but my gut was telling me that it wasn't good. For a few moments, there was nothing. I listened, trying to pick up any hint of movement, but the forest was silent again. It was a strange silence, though not peaceful like before. It was as if everything had stopped again, holding its breath, waiting. I looked around the summit, trying to spot any movement. There was nothing. The trail to the other side was empty. The only thing I could see were trees, rocks, and open sky. But the feeling in my chest, the unease, the discomfort was growing stronger. Something was wrong. I began to make my way down the trail, moving quickly but cautiously, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees. My mind raced. Was it just an animal? A bear? Maybe. The trail had been pretty remote, so it wasn't impossible. But there was a nagging feeling in my gut, telling me it wasn't just an animal. The trail began to twist and narrow again, the trees closing in around me. I had descended a few hundred feet when I heard it again. A loud snap, like a branch breaking under the weight of something. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the trail behind me was empty. I quickened my pace, trying not to panic. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my feet hitting the ground and the wind in the trees. I reached a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure just standing in the distance, barely visible between the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching. The figure was tall, too tall, and it stood unnaturally still, almost like it was waiting for me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no time to think. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted down the trail, my lungs burning as I pushed myself harder. The sounds of footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, grew louder. Someone or something was definitely following me now. I didn't dare look back, my heart thundering in my chest as I fought to keep my feet under me, the trail growing steeper and rougher with each step. I pushed on, not caring about the rocks or the trees or anything else. I just needed to get away. I couldn't tell how far I'd run, but the sounds behind me grew fainter, and I dared a glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone. I slowed to a halt, my body shaking, my chest heaving with exhaustion. I couldn't see anyone. The trail was empty, but I wasn't convinced. For the next hour, I kept moving, but more cautiously. The fear still gnawed at me, an ever-present weight in the pit of my stomach. The forest around me had become oppressive, and every snap of a branch made me jump. By the time I finally made it back to the truck, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I didn't stick around. I didn't stop to check in with anyone. I just got in, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that trail. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and whatever or whoever it was watching me. I haven't hiked alone since. It started off like any other hike I had done before. I'd been planning to take a week off work just to clear my head, get away from everything, and enjoy being outside for once without any real stress. I picked a place I hadn't explored yet, the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I read a few things about the trails online, some blogs, some maps. There were long stretches with almost no service, and that was part of the appeal. I didn't want distractions. I didn't want to hear anyone talking. I just wanted to walk, be alone, and feel the silence again. I'd done solo hikes before, long ones too. I knew what to bring. I packed light but smart, my sleeping bag, a one-person tent, water filters, stove, food for 5 days, GPS, bear spray, knife, first aid kit, my phone with offline maps, and 2 paper backups just in case. I double-checked everything the night before. Weather looked fine, a little rain maybe, but not too bad. I drove up the long dirt road to the trailhead early that Monday morning. It was cold but sunny. There was still some snow tucked away in the shadows of the trees, even in late spring. I saw no other cars at the trailhead, which made me kind of happy. It meant I would probably have the trail to myself. That's what I wanted. No other hikers, no kids with Bluetooth speakers blasting music, no random conversations. Just the sound of boots on dirt and the wind through trees. I started hiking around 8 a.m. The trail was well defined for the first few miles, winding through tall pines and past small creeks. The air smelled like wet bark and pine needles. I felt good. I wasn't in any rush. I planned to take my time and maybe set up camp by the lake I'd seen on the map, about 12 miles in. It was quiet in a way that feels different from the city. It wasn't total silence. There were birds, squirrels, branches creaking, but it was natural, calming. The kind of quiet that makes you feel small but in a good way. By midday, I stopped near a stream, took off my pack, boiled some water, and made a hot lunch. I sat on a flat rock, dipping my feet in the icy water while I ate. I felt relaxed. My mind wasn't racing like it usually did. For the first time in months, I felt really present. I kept moving after that, hiking through some denser forest and up a gradual incline that took a few hours. Around 4 p.m., I made it to the lake. It was still, glassy, and surrounded by pine-covered ridges. I walked along the shore until I found a spot that was flat and slightly raised, far enough from the water but close enough to hear it. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and just sat there for a while as the sky dimmed and the wind picked up a little. The night was peaceful, cold but not unbearable. I fell asleep fast. No nightmares, no worries. The second day, I followed a smaller trail that looped up into one of the ridges and back down into a more remote valley. I didn't see anyone, not even signs of other people. The trail was narrower, and some parts were covered in fallen branches and loose rock. I had to stop a few times to check the map and make sure I was still on the right path. The GPS signal came and went. That night, I camped deeper in, at a clearing where the trees opened up enough to see stars. There was a strange silence that night, heavier than before. Not eerie at first, just still. But I noticed there weren't many animal sounds. No owls, no rustling. Just wind, and even that died down after a while. I heard something move around midnight. It wasn't close, but it was big, bigger than a deer. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. I didn't see anything. Could have been an elk. Or a bear. I didn't feel scared right away, just more alert. I stayed awake for a few hours, listening. The noise didn't come back. The next morning, I packed up and pushed deeper into the valley, wanting to make a loop that would eventually bring me back around to the main trail over the next 2 days. That day felt different. The woods felt heavier. I know that sounds vague, but it's the only way I can explain it. Something about the way the trees leaned in or the way the wind sounded. It made everything feel a little more closed off. I saw something strange around noon. It was a pile of rocks. Not natural, stacked intentionally, 3 or 4 feet high, balanced too carefully to have happened on its own. I'd seen cairns before, but this didn't look like a trail marker. It was in a place where no path was visible, half sunk in thick underbrush. There were small bones scattered around the base, maybe rabbit or squirrel, and what looked like torn cloth stuck to a branch nearby. I stared at it for a while. Something about it made me uncomfortable. I took a wide path around it, brushing through trees and getting scratched by branches. I kept checking my map. The GPS wouldn't load, and the compass on my phone was acting weird, spinning slowly in circles. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing distant cracks in the trees. I kept thinking about that rock pile. I told myself it was just someone's old marker, maybe even an old hunter's spot or something, but it didn't feel that way. The 4th day was when things really started to go wrong. I woke up early and started hiking again, wanting to make it to the next ridgeline before dark. The terrain was rough, steep, covered in loose stone and wet patches from recent snowmelt. The trail, if there even was one, started to disappear under thick ferns and fallen trees. Around mid-morning, I slipped. I stepped on a damp rock that gave way, and I fell hard onto my right side, sliding a few feet before I stopped. My backpack cushioned me a little, but my ankle twisted beneath me. I knew right away it was bad. Not broken, but bad. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I took off my boot, and my ankle was already swelling. I wrapped it tight, took some painkillers, and leaned against a tree. I had to decide fast. I could try to keep moving forward, but there was no guarantee the trail would get easier. Or I could try to backtrack, but I was already a day out from the lake, and my GPS still wouldn't work. I had a paper map, but I wasn't exactly sure where I was on it anymore. I decided to keep moving forward, thinking the terrain might open up soon. I moved slow, using a thick branch as a crutch. Every step hurt. Every mile felt like 5. I rationed my water and food more tightly now. I didn't want to run out in case I got stuck. Late that afternoon, I saw something that made my stomach twist. It was a jacket, faded red, lying in the brush off to the side. I hobbled over to look. It was torn in a few places, stained with what looked like old blood. Underneath it, half covered in pine needles, was a torn backpack. There was no one around. No body, no bones, just that gear. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and kept moving. I started yelling occasionally, just in case someone might hear me. I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't get one. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Something was in the woods again. It wasn't even quiet about it this time. I heard it moving, not running, but walking. Slow, steady steps. Not a bear. Bears aren't that patient. This was something that followed a pattern, walked, paused, walked again. Stayed far away, but close enough that I heard it crack sticks and brush. I lay in my tent, holding my knife and my bear spray, breathing through my nose to stay quiet. I didn't turn on my light. The steps stopped after a few hours. When the sun came up, I packed and left fast, barely eating. My ankle throbbed. I kept thinking about the jacket, the torn bag, the rock pile, the silence in the trees. That day was a blur. I lost the trail completely. I kept moving downhill, thinking I'd hit a stream or road eventually. My water was almost gone. My ankle was worse. Then, finally, I saw something through the trees that almost made me cry. A logging road. Dirt, old, overgrown, but still real. Still human. I limped down it for hours until I saw the faint line of tire tracks. By the end of that day, I reached a small shack used by trail crews. It was empty but had a solar-powered emergency beacon. I hit the button and waited. I didn't care how long it took. A helicopter came the next morning. The crew looked at me like I was half dead. I probably looked like it. I told them I got lost, hurt my ankle, ran out of trail. I didn't tell them about the jacket, or the rock pile, or the steps in the night. Back home, I didn't tell anyone the full story either. What would I even say? There was no proof of anything. No pictures, no video, just scratches, bruises, and a twisted ankle. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I still hike, but never alone now. And never without checking every piece of gear 3 times over. I stick to trails with people on them, even if I hate the noise. Because somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, something's out there. Maybe it's just a person. Maybe it's something worse, not supernatural, just human in the most dangerous kind of way. Whatever it is, I don't want to be near it again. I had always liked hiking alone. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but I found peace in silence. My life back in the city was loud. Constant traffic, constant notifications, voices echoing off concrete and glass. I worked in IT and spent 10 hours a day staring at a monitor. So, when I had the chance to take a week off, I picked a spot far from everything. An area in the mountains of Northern California I'd never been to before. It was called Bannock Ridge. The thing about Bannock Ridge was that it wasn't completely remote, but it wasn't exactly popular either. A few online forums mentioned it, mostly from backpackers who preferred trails that didn't show up on official maps. There were rumors of old mining roads in the area, some trails that had been abandoned decades ago. That was what drew me in. I packed up the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, stove, extra fuel, satellite communicator, backup batteries, a loaded GPS, maps, water filters, everything I usually brought. I even left a detailed itinerary with my brother and told him I'd check in every 48 hours through the SAT device. If I didn't, he was supposed to call the rangers. My plan was to do a 3-day loop up one side of the ridge, cross the summit, and come back down another trail. I arrived early in the morning on the first day, parked at the empty lot, signed in at the trailhead log, and started hiking. The air smelled like pine and cold rock. It was late September, and although the weather was stable, I knew things could shift fast in the mountains. The first few hours were beautiful. The trail was mostly shaded, but occasionally I'd get clearings that showed the valley below. I passed a small creek, and the sound of running water made everything feel calm. There weren't any other people around. I didn't even see fresh boot prints, just old, faded ones probably from earlier in the season. That night, I set up camp in a small clearing beneath a cluster of spruce trees. I boiled water for food, ate slowly, and sat in silence until the light faded. The woods were quiet. No insects, no wind, just that eerie, absolute stillness that sometimes settles in thick forests. I slept lightly but peacefully, and in the morning, I packed up and moved on. By late afternoon on the second day, I was climbing toward the ridge's high point. The trail grew rougher, more overgrown. Parts of it had collapsed from erosion, and I had to detour more than once, pushing through underbrush and sliding on loose rock. Still, nothing felt out of the ordinary. I expected parts of the trail to be difficult, especially in lesser-traveled areas. It was near the summit that I saw the old marker. It was a wooden post driven into the ground at an angle, its paint long faded, the wood cracked and gray. There was no sign or direction attached, just the post and a faint path leading off the main trail toward the right. The GPS showed nothing there. The topographic map didn't mark a route either. I probably should have ignored it, but something about that post looked intentional, like it once marked something important. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I figured I'd follow the path for a few hundred yards, see where it led, and then return to the main trail. The path was narrow and faint, but definitely man-made at some point. Old willow ruts were carved into the soil beneath the moss and pine needles, and tree trunks near the path were marked with faded cuts. I guess this used to be an access road for logging or mining. I kept walking, expecting it to dead-end quickly, but it didn't. In fact, it widened after about half a mile and started descending steeply into a thick forest pocket that didn't show up clearly on my GPS. My topo map showed a drop, but no trails. About 2 miles in, I realized I was too far to double back before nightfall. I figured I'd camp nearby and retrace my steps in the morning. I set up in a small flat patch near the edge of a dry stream bed. There were no animal tracks, no scat, nothing fresh, which I liked. But that night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Not from noise, again it was dead quiet, but from this weird tension in my body, like my mind was aware of something my senses weren't picking up. I lay still in my bag, eyes open in the dark, just listening. I told myself it was just the isolation or maybe the altitude. In the morning, I packed quickly. I walked back the way I thought I'd come, but almost immediately, things looked off. Couldn't find the ruts. The cuts on the trees were gone. I backtracked and circled for nearly an hour before I realized I didn't recognize anything. I pulled out the GPS, but the device wouldn't get a signal. No satellites. That was unusual but not impossible in thick forest. I tried the satellite communicator. It flashed red. No connection. That was when I felt the first real pang of fear. I tried using the compass and topo map to orient myself. The stream bed sloped north to south, and according to the elevation lines, I should have been able to follow it northward and hit the ridge again. I began walking, but after 3 hours of climbing, I ended up on a steep, brush-choked slope that didn't match anything on my map. I couldn't even see the sun clearly. It stayed hazy behind a thick, high cloud cover all day. That's when I made my biggest mistake. Instead of stopping and camping to reorient, I kept pushing, convinced I could regain the trail before dark. The ground got worse, slick with moss and pine needles, ankle-deep in deadfall and rotten wood. I slid down an embankment at one point and gashed my forearm on a broken branch. Nothing deep, but it bled enough to soak through my sleeve. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I set up my tent on uneven ground surrounded by dense woods. I boiled water for food but had no appetite. I forced myself to eat and drank what I could, then cleaned and bandaged my arm. Sleep didn't come. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something. Not animals. It was heavy, slow, crunching, like boots. I sat up inside the tent, holding my breath. The sound moved around me, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I didn't move, didn't even unzip the flap. I just sat frozen for what felt like hours. Then, nothing. Silence again. In the morning, I found nothing. No tracks, no broken twigs, no sign of anything or anyone. I started walking again, now following elevation as my guide. I figured if I could get high enough, I'd spot the ridge or the sun or something useful. That day was worse than the last. The forest got thicker. Thorns ripped my pants. Something stung my neck and left a welt. I started rationing water and realized I hadn't urinated in nearly 24 hours. I was dehydrated. Around mid-afternoon, I came across something man-made. An old hunting blind, half-collapsed and covered in moss. Nearby, there were rusted cans and the broken frame of what looked like an ATV. That gave me hope. Someone had been out here, maybe not recently, but it meant I wasn't deep wilderness. I camped near the blind that night. Again, the sounds came, heavier this time, closer. Still no voices, still no animal sounds. Just that steady, deliberate crunching, like someone walking in a wide circle. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat with the knife in my hand, cold sweat drying on my neck. In the morning, I left everything except water and the sat communicator and climbed a nearby hill. The top had a partial view, enough to see a sliver of clearing in the far distance. I marked the direction and hiked toward it. Took all day. The ground flattened a little. Trees thinned. I saw more trash, broken bottles, a shredded tarp. I began shouting, hoping for help, though I didn't expect an answer. Just before dusk, I saw it. A road, a real one. Dirt, but clearly used. Fresh tire tracks. Even a cigarette, but still warm enough that it hadn't soaked through. I dropped to my knees and just sat there for a long time. Eventually, I followed the road. It took another hour, but I saw a gate. Beyond it, a hunting cabin, windows boarded, but smoke coming from a chimney. I banged on the door, but no one answered. It was locked. I sat outside until nightfall, then used my multi-tool to force the latch. I didn't care anymore. I needed shelter. The place was empty. Food in cans, water bottles, a radio that didn't work, but it was shelter. I locked the door behind me and finally slept, knife under the pillow. I stayed there for 2 more nights. On the second morning, my satellite device got a signal. I messaged my brother. Rescue came by ATV that afternoon. Turns out I had veered nearly 8 miles southeast from my planned route, down into an area that used to be privately owned mining land. It was abandoned after a landslide decades ago and never added to official maps. The trail I took wasn't marked because it had been closed off and reabsorbed by the forest. As for the sounds at night, no one had answers. The rangers said maybe it was deer, or an old squatter, maybe even a bear. But I knew the sound of boots. I'd heard them walking slowly, intentionally, circling my tent. I never found out who it was, or what they wanted. I still hike, but I don't go off-trail anymore. I had been planning the solo hiking trip for months. I'd spent all winter looking at maps, watching videos, reading other hikers' trip reports, and checking gear reviews. My plan was to do a 3-day solo hike in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. I picked a route that wasn't on many blogs, something a bit off the beaten path but not totally wild. It followed a ridge, passed a couple of remote alpine lakes, dipped into some steep forested valleys, and finally looped back down through a gulch into a trailhead far from where I started. I'd arranged a shuttle to drop me at one end and pick me up at the other. The weather had been decent the week before. Some light rain, colder nights, but nothing unusual for late spring in that area. I checked the forecast one last time the night before. It said there might be some flurries at higher elevation, but otherwise nothing serious. I figured I'd be fine. I started early in the morning, parking my car at the end point and hopping in the shuttle. The driver was an old guy who didn't talk much. He dropped me at the trailhead around 7 a.m., gave a quick wave, and drove off. The air was cold and dry. The sun had just started to rise above the trees. Felt good. The first few miles went smooth. I was moving fast, warmed up quick. The trail climbed steadily but not too steep. I passed a frozen stream, still mostly covered in snow, and hiked up through some thick pine trees. There were no footprints. No one had been on the trail recently. I liked that. I wasn't looking for solitude for any deep reason. I just wanted to be out there alone, without people around. I liked the quiet, the focus it gave me. By mid-afternoon, I made it to the ridge, where the wind picked up. Snow covered parts of the trail, even though it was almost June. I saw a few marmots scurry between rocks and heard the distant cry of a hawk. I stopped at a flat area near a small, frozen lake to eat something. My legs were already sore. I had about 10 more miles to cover before I'd reach the area I'd planned to camp. After resting, I moved on. The trail became less obvious. Snow buried some sections, and I had to rely on my GPS to stay on track. I didn't like that, but I figured it was temporary. The further I went, the more I realized how slow snow travel really is. Even with gaiters on, my feet kept punching through into the icy crust. It wasn't deep, but it was annoying and made progress much slower than I expected. Around 5 p.m., I came across a small avalanche field. Broken trees and rocks had slid down the slope and covered the trail. I tried to go around, but the detour took a long time and pushed me closer to the edge of a steep drop-off. The snow in that area felt hollow underfoot, and I didn't like that either. Still, I kept moving. I reached my planned campsite late. It was an exposed spot near the treeline, flat enough for a tent and with a view of the valley below. The snow had melted mostly there. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and got in my sleeping bag. My shoulders hurt from the pack weight, my knees were aching, and my socks were damp. But it was okay. I was alone under a cold sky full of stars, and the silence was the kind I liked. Total. That night, the wind howled. My tent flapped constantly. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I had to get out to pee, and the wind nearly ripped the door off the tent when I unzipped it. The cold bit into my fingers, and when I looked up, I could see clouds moving in fast. I knew then the forecast was wrong. By sunrise, the sky was completely gray. Snowflakes were falling. Not many, just enough to make everything look like a slow-fading photograph. I ate a quick breakfast and packed up. My plan was to descend into the valley that day and make it to a creek crossing by evening. The route would be downhill most of the way, but it was steep and narrow in places. The first couple miles weren't bad. The snow wasn't sticking yet, but by the time I was halfway down the slope, it started piling up fast. The trail disappeared again, and I found myself standing in shin-deep powder, slipping on wet rocks hidden underneath. The trees closed in tightly, and I lost sight of the ridge behind me. I knew I wasn't supposed to descend too far to the left, because that would drop me into a gorge I couldn't climb out of. But the trail was gone and the snow was hiding everything. My GPS kept glitching. The dense trees must have been interfering with the signal. I stopped and checked my paper map. I couldn't tell exactly where I was, but I had a general idea. I figured if I followed the slope gently downhill, angling to the right, I'd hit the creek I was aiming for. It sounded reasonable, so I started moving again. That's when the snow really started coming down. Thick flakes, heavy, wet, falling faster and faster. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. My footprints vanished behind me in minutes. I felt the first real edge of fear around then. Not panic, just the quiet kind that creeps in when things start stacking against you. I kept going, but the terrain got worse. Down trees, hidden holes, slick rocks, and deep snow. I slipped at one point and went down hard, my left thigh slamming into a buried stump. It didn't break anything, but the pain was sharp. I sat there for a minute, breathing heavy, snow melting into the collar of my jacket. I told myself to get up and keep moving. I didn't want to lose daylight, but by the time it started getting dark, I still hadn't found the creek. I pitched my tent in a cramped, snowy patch under some trees. I boiled water, ate a frozen bar, and crawled into my bag still wearing half my wet clothes. I kept hearing sounds outside the tent, branches cracking, snow falling in clumps. At one point, something large moved through the woods near me. It didn't make a noise like a bear or an elk, just slow, careful steps through the snow. I held my breath, gripped my knife, waited. Nothing happened. The next morning, I was disoriented. The whole forest looked the same. Snow was deeper up to my knees. I was cold, sore, and tired. I didn't want to keep going downhill without knowing where I was, so I tried to backtrack uphill to get a GPS signal. Took hours. When it finally connected, I realized I had dropped way too far south, way off the trail, deep into a section of forest with no easy way out. I was mad at myself, but there was no point in getting emotional. I looked at the map and decided to cut across the slope eastward to reconnect with the trail above a switchback. It seemed like the best option, even though it would be slow. I packed up and started walking again. That cross-slope hike was the worst part of the trip. The snow was deep, and the slope was steep enough that every step had to be careful. I couldn't tell what was underneath the snow. Sometimes it was solid, sometimes I sank to my hip in a hole. I almost lost my footing a few times, sliding a few feet downhill before stopping myself with my poles. Eventually, I got to a narrow ledge only a few feet wide with a steep drop below. I had to cross it to keep going. I told myself to move slow, dig my boots in. I was halfway across when the snow gave out under my left foot. I fell onto my side, slid fast toward the edge, and somehow stopped just short of it by jamming my foot into a tree root sticking out of the slope. I didn't move for a full minute. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I slowly backed away, crawled on hands and knees back across the ledge, and sat against a tree once I was safe. I knew then I couldn't keep pushing in that direction. It was too risky. I changed plans again. I decided to descend straight down and follow the valley floor, hoping I'd find the creek and maybe even the gulch trail that looped back to my car. I was at least 15 miles from the trailhead, maybe more. I had enough food for 2 more days, but barely. My water filter was starting to freeze between uses. I was running out of time. The valley floor was brutal. Thick brush, deep snow, fallen trees. Every 50 feet I had to climb over or crawl under something. My legs were cut and bruised. My gloves were soaked through. I stopped every hour to rest and eat something small. I was burning thousands of calories and barely putting anything back in. At one point, I stepped into what looked like a shallow snowdrift and dropped straight into a creek. Ice-cold water rushed into my boots. I scrambled out, dumped the water, but my pants and socks were soaked. I kept moving because I had no other choice. That night, I didn't pitch my tent. I just lay under a tree in my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm. I kept waking up, shaking violently, coughing. My legs cramped from exhaustion. I was starting to feel slow, confused, like my brain wasn't working right. Hypothermia. I knew the signs. In the morning, the snow had stopped. The air was clear. I forced myself to eat, packed up, and started walking again. After about 2 hours of dragging myself through the woods, I finally heard it, the sound of rushing water. Not a small trickle, but something bigger. I pushed toward it, and there it was, the main creek. Wide, fast, icy. I followed it downstream for an hour until I saw something that made me stop cold. A boot print, then another, and a faint trail. The trail. I was back on it. I had been planning the hike for almost a month. I was tired of sitting at home and working on the computer every day, staring at the screen from morning till night. I needed a break from the noise, the people, the lights. I wanted something quiet, something real. So I picked a spot on the map that looked far enough from the city but still reachable by car. It was in a part of the state I hadn't been to before, somewhere in the mountains about 4 hours north. The trail was called Dead Ridge, which sounded dramatic, but it was just a name. A narrow trail that ran through the national forest, looping for about 22 miles and passing a couple of ridgelines and an old fire lookout. I planned to do the whole loop over 2 days, camping at the halfway point. I packed light but careful. My tent, a light sleeping bag, a change of clothes, food for 3 days, water, a filter, stove, extra batteries, first aid kit, GPS, maps, and a personal locator beacon. I was used to hiking alone and I knew the drill. I left my route details with my brother, told him when to expect me back, and set off early that morning. The drive was quiet. The roads got narrower the deeper I went into the hills, and by the time I reached the trailhead, I hadn't seen another car in over 30 minutes. The parking area was empty. The air was cool and damp, and everything smelled like pine and moss. I locked my car, slung on my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but clear, weaving through the trees with the occasional small climb. Birds chirped in the branches above me. The forest felt untouched, almost forgotten. I liked it. I passed a stream where the water was cold and fast. I filled my bottle and used the filter to drink. I moved steadily, not rushing. I wanted to enjoy it. After about 5 hours, the terrain changed. The trail started climbing more sharply, and the trees thinned out. I could see more of the sky. The ridge came into view just before sunset. I followed the trail along the narrow path up the spine of the mountain, where the wind picked up. There were sheer drops on both sides, and I walked slowly. The ridge itself was beautiful. Bare rock, patches of grass, and long views in every direction. I could see for miles. At the top of the ridge, I found a flat spot among the trees just below the crest and decided to camp there. I set up my tent, boiled water for dinner, and watched the sky go orange, then purple, then dark. The stars came out in the thousands. I didn't hear a single car, plane, or voice, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle from some animal moving nearby. I went to sleep that night feeling peaceful, but something changed in the morning. I woke up just before sunrise. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that gets in your bones. My breath came out in thick clouds. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. That's when I noticed it. Boot prints in the dirt near my tent. Not mine, not old. They circled my tent once and then walked off toward the trail. My heart thudded in my chest. I looked around carefully, scanning the trees, the trail, the ridge. I didn't see anyone, but I knew those prints hadn't been there when I set up camp. I had checked the ground. It was soft from rain 2 days ago, and any marks would have stood out. These prints were deep, fresh, sharp-edged. Someone had come through while I was sleeping. I felt my throat tighten. My stomach went cold. I tried to stay calm. I packed up quickly and got moving. I didn't hear anything unusual. No breaking branches, no voices, no footsteps. But I kept looking over my shoulder. After a mile or so, I convinced myself it was just another hiker. Maybe someone had arrived late, walked by my tent, and kept going. I hadn't heard them because I was sleeping. It made sense, sort of, but I didn't see anyone all morning. The trail dropped down off the ridge into a dense forest. The trees grew close, and the ground was damp. There were no birds here, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the dirt. I walked fast, trying to make good time and shake off the feeling I had. But it didn't go away. Around midday, I reached the halfway point of the loop. There was an old fire lookout tower here, marked on the map. It was no longer in use, just a rusting frame of metal and old wooden steps, half collapsed. I climbed partway up to get a view and sat for lunch. I kept scanning the tree line below. I didn't see anything. I didn't like how quiet it was. I hiked another 3 miles after lunch and came to a small clearing beside a shallow creek. I stopped there for water. When I bent down to fill my bottle, I noticed something odd across the creek. A sock, just lying in the grass on the far side. White, dirty, and worn, like it had been there a day at most. No one leaves just one sock. I stood up straight and looked around again. Nothing moved. I crossed the creek and checked the sock. It was stiff with dirt but not soaked. A few feet away was an energy bar wrapper. Torn, flattened. A different brand than I used. Someone had been here. I moved on faster now. I didn't know what I was trying to outrun. I just knew I didn't want to be out here much longer. The trees seemed darker than they had in the morning. The air was still cold. Everything felt off, like the woods were holding their breath. I checked my GPS, but the signal dropped in and out under the trees. I relied on the map. The trail split in 2 directions at the next fork, one path going slightly uphill, the other down toward a ravine. Both would rejoin after a few miles. I took the uphill one, thinking it might be harder for anyone to follow. I climbed for about an hour before stopping to rest. I drank some water and sat on a fallen log. That's when I heard it. A stick broke. Not near me, far off, maybe 100 yards, but loud, sharp. Then another. I froze. My ears rang in the silence. I stood slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I could feel something. That feeling you get when someone's watching you. I waited, barely breathing. The sound didn't come again. I started walking again, slower now, careful. I moved another mile, watching the trail behind me more than ahead. Still nothing. Then I saw the second footprint. This one was in a patch of mud near a spring. Deep, fresh. Same boot tread as the ones near my tent. I crouched down to look. There were two prints. One facing the spring, one turned slightly, like someone had stood there and then turned around. I didn't drink from that spring. I didn't stop again. The sun was getting lower. I checked my location. I had about 5 miles left to the car. I told myself I could make it before dark if I moved quickly. I started hiking faster. I didn't take breaks. I didn't look around anymore. I just moved. With about 2 miles left, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A fire. Not burning, but the remains of one. Still warm. Just off the trail behind a thick patch of trees. Someone had been here within the hour. I stepped closer. There was a torn piece of tarp on the ground and a pile of what looked like food wrappers. The ashes were gray and soft. I could still feel heat coming off them. I turned and kept walking. My hands shook. I kept my eyes on the trail. Every part of me wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay steady. I didn't want to trip. I didn't want to fall. I kept moving. The last mile felt like 10. The woods grew thicker. The trees pressed in. Every branch, every leaf, every sound made me flinch. I kept thinking I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, a shape. But when I turned, there was nothing. When I finally saw the edge of the parking lot through the trees, I almost cried. My car was still there, alone. I ran the last 30 yards and fumbled with the keys. My hands were numb. I got in, slammed the door, locked it. I sat there for a full minute, breathing hard. I looked at the trail one last time. I saw nothing. I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I was on the highway. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see a truck following or a shadow on the side of the road. But there was nothing. When I got home, I didn't unpack. I just took a long shower, sat on the couch, and stared at the wall. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing twigs snapping. I kept seeing that single sock, the burnt fire pit, the footprints circling my tent. I tried to tell myself it was just some other hiker. Maybe they didn't mean any harm. Maybe they didn't even know I was there. Maybe it was just coincidence. But it didn't feel like coincidence. I reported what I saw to the ranger station the next day. I didn't have much to tell, no photos, no clear sign of a crime, just a bad feeling. They took down my notes, said they'd send someone to check the trail. I never heard anything back. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been hiking since. I still think about it, though, every day. I replay it over and over in my head. What if I had stayed at that first camp another hour? What if I had taken the other trail at the fork? What if I had stopped at that spring? What if I had turned